Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm really glad I made the poster session because you guys are great. And I don't say that usually lightly or often, as some of my friends can say. So I can say after listening to you speak this morning that I would recommend that you view this like an anthropological experience for the next couple hours. I'm from a different tribe, and I communicate in different ways, and I'm not, and it's not superior. In fact, in many ways, I now feel inferior after watching you describe your research. But I would say, view me as a resource for how psychologists might view the same topics that you do. I can say straight off the bat that psychology, of course, does not view the world the same way you do, so we don't attack things with the same rigor. Most of the stuff I'll show you today is what I would call descriptive. I've spent the large portion of my career doing what I call descriptive work. Personality psychologists are the geologists of psychology, right? Look at that rock. That's cool, it's green, right? We do that with humans, and we tend to catalog the different rocks, place them together, and get very excited about the colors, ages, and things of that sort, but we don't often dig in and try to figure out the chemical composition or causal nature of the relationship between the rocks or how they formed. We tend to describe a lot, and so the talks today will be, for the most part, erring on that side. With at least one caveat that having been exposed to you, and I'm saying you as in the fact that most of you are economists, I've started practicing some economics, so I control for things now a lot more than I used to. And so, but there'd be no serious causal claims being made. I am by definition a non-cognitive psychologist. I greatly appreciate the fact that economists have now been able to describe me accurately. And I should tell you that as a personality psychologist, I kind of came to terms with that term and tried to use it in my work. My friends will not let me do that. Every time I use the term non-cognitive in a paper, I get punished in review. It's like, you can't call our field non-cognitive. But nonetheless, as you are familiar with, we are in what might be called the non-cognitive era. These are some of the individuals that have helped put all of this together, and they should be given some credit. Many of my students, colleagues, and postdocs. So this is a representation of a group effort, not an individual effort by any means. I want to start with a question for you, so you're going to have to participate a little bit. So imagine you're an advisor to some parents. How many of you have kids? Okay, so we have some. Okay, cool. Married? Okay, so that's good. We're a little older. Usually, like, grad students are like, what are you talking about? So your friends ask you over dinner, okay, we're a little boring, we're going to have kids. What should we do to maximize our kids' outcomes, right? Where should we move? What kind of educational opportunities should we give them? What kind of parenting practices, and why? Some of you have kids. You've already kind of made those decisions. You might have moved to neighborhoods because you thought that school district is best, right? You might have read the voluminous literature on parenting practices. And there's a book for each of you, I trust me, that will tell you that what you do is right. But there's lots of things you can do to discover how you should properly parent and the like, right? So if you're in the business of giving advice, what are the best things that you can tell somebody who's going to have some kids and they're going to prepare them for their future? So what would you advise?
Invest early.
Invest early, but in what? I'm okay with the money. As an American, paying for my daughter's college education, I should have invested earlier. But I could have moved to Germany.
It seems like even like the time you spend with your kid, how you
Okay.
give that time.
Give them time under the assumption, I assume, that I matter as a parent and that my actions might relate to their outcomes. Interesting. Okay. So then I shouldn't work. Or I should become an academic because we have a lot of freedom, right? I don't often tell people, but when I was younger, when we had young kids, my wife and I worked a staggered schedule where we both worked 4 days a week so that we could only put them in daycare for 3 days a week. We did that not because we thought that would be the best for our kids, but because we wanted to be with them. So it's a very selfish, very short-sighted thing, but we did that. But I want to at least tell you that it's possible to have a career and invest in that way. I'm not saying it's the best thing, though. Okay, so invest with time. What else would you do? Yeah.
Talk to your children and show feelings, like kiss them, hug them.
positive feelings, not negative feelings. Is that okay?
Maybe like also say that something is wrong, but
Okay,
you don't
okay.
need to hit them.
Okay. Don't spank, right? That's a very common thing in the United States now. There's recommendations to not spank children, right? Pardon?
I was just saying that it's weird that you have to recommend that. Yeah.
There's some subsections of the American populace that spank, and it seems to have no noticeable effect. So, good, yeah. So, maybe it's not weird, right? So, you speak to your kids a lot. Why? Because there's supposedly some research showing that if you speak to your kids a lot, they'll be smarter, right? So, by investing that way. That, by the way, has been called into question in the last few months. A reanalysis, at least, is showing the effect size is much smaller. Effect sizes will be a theme as we go forward because my tribe has a different interpretation of effect sizes than your tribe, which is going to be interesting. So, what I think is small, you think is fine. So, but we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so we're going to talk to our kids, give them time, and not spank them. Yeah.
Being predictable, like having clear rules and sticking to them.
Okay. Being a consistent parent, not a permissive and inconsistent parent, because being a permissive and inconsistent parent is putatively related to negative outcomes for kids, right? So if you're going to punish your kids and spank them, at least do so consistently. Well, there are people who say that, right? That if you're going to do it consistently, because the worst possible thing you could do to kids is create an inconsistent world for them that's unpredictable, right? Right? Okay.
I would say listen to them and be interested in what they are thinking about and what they experience.
Interesting. Okay. It's fascinating what you as economists are not saying. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess people have said things that you would do specifically to raise your kids, but what maximizes your chances, at least in the United States, is that you stay in a stable relationship, right? And that you live in a place with like a decent education.
Right. So you can move to a neighborhood, like in America, the obsession is over what neighborhood you're going to go to because that's going to be your school district, which is going to determine the entire future of your family. Yeah, right.
The like stable relationships apparently that have positive impacts.
One of the best ways for women in America to experience poverty is divorce. I mean, it's a policy concern at the Social Security Administration because it's really true, right? And so stable relationships, whether good or bad, are a buffer in some respects for some of these things. Yeah.
So we're mixing correlations and causality. Right?
I'm not asking about causality yet. I just want to make, I mean, how do you know? You're telling your friends, right? I mean, you know, you're trying to give them advice.
On a predictive level, I would say don't get divorced and collect more years of education because these are the best predictors of life success.
Right. Okay. So, but you say collect your own years of education, right? So the parent should.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you for being the economist I was hoping was here.
This is a causal question, right? You wouldn't advise the first two bullet points don't line up.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, that's again the tribal difference here. As a psychologist, I don't have experiments, and I don't necessarily believe in some of the controls you guys use. Or let's say we seldom have the data that you do in terms of kind of regression discontinuity designs and IC designs. So we don't necessarily typically think any of our studies show causality, and so we tend to approach things modestly. So we'll say predict at most. So, but it's always with the assumption that what we're studying is going to be proven to be causal by you. At least I hope. Yeah.
So I guess the really economist answer is just to say, be richer. I mean, it's pretty clear, so you should be ready.
Right.
I mean, I know it's not a helpful answer to tell my friends when they have kids, but it's probably...
But I mean, we had one person say you should invest more time. I chose to stay home. If I didn't stay home and I worked 6 hours or 6 days a week rather than 4, which some of my friends did, and maximize my economic utility early, I would be earning more money now and have more freedom to travel to Europe. No, you have, right? And I could have given my kids more resources, more skills and things through the money I earned. So we have these choices that we make, and we think, okay, at some level I have to invest in these different portfolios, right? And which one's going to be causal, and which one's going to be a worthwhile investment. So let me go through some of the traditional answers. So sociologists might answer be rich, right? Or move somewhere where the conditions mitigate not being rich. I would move to Europe in a heartbeat over America because you mitigate poverty much better than we do, right? So the effects of poverty in the United States, I think somebody just estimated that if we just paid a little bit more for welfare, we would gain 3 years of life for the people who are in poorer states and populations in the United States. We just don't do a good job. Other places, other countries do, move there. Within the United States, move to California, move to New York, move to places that actually take care of their people. An economist might say, be rich and be smart, right? I was surprised nobody said smart, because that, of course, is one of the best predictors of a lot of outcomes. Educational attainment by the child, of course, right? And that's a relatively strong causal factor, according to you, that's going to then subsequently affect their life quite well. It's related to better health, better longevity, better outcomes in occupations. So traditionally, that was the economics answer.
But that's difficult to change once you have the children. So
I'm not talking about necessarily changing. I'm just saying, like, if you're going to give advice, well, you can say assortative mating, right? Before they have a relationship, before they have kids, marry somebody smart. Best thing you could do. An educational researcher, on the other hand, which is another tribe that I tend to participate in, would have a completely different answer. It's like, don't assume anything about the child or yourself. Get them a good education. Make sure that's what they get. So it's kind of consistent with the economics perspective, but it typically doesn't want to assume anything about the child or the person that's going into it. The psychologist traditionally would answer, ignore personality. And this is a paraphrase of Ernst Fair's question to me at one point. We were having a meeting and he said, Brent, I'm confused. When I was young, I went to the psychologist. I had this idea that I should be interested in personality and individual differences as a potential form of human capital. But I went to my friends in the psychology department. I said, hey, I'd like to do this. And they said, the last thing you should do is invest in personality, either in your research or in your ideas. And that was circa 1970, 1980. Armand asked me to expand on this a little bit. Personality psychology has had an interesting sinusoidal curve in terms of its existence across history. It was peaked basically in the 1950s. Then in the 1960s in America especially, behaviorism reached a peak, cognitive psychology reached a peak, and then social psychology did. And we were kind of blank slaters at that point. In the late 1960s, we thought we could reform the world and reform humanity through our efforts, and the idea that there were things inside people that were, let's say, consequential became very unpopular. And so a lot of the programs and a lot of the people just kind of died off, especially in the 70s. And so if you think about the status hierarchy of economics in the United States, what are the 5 schools you have to go to? Chicago, MIT, Princeton, Harvard, right? What's the other one? What am I missing? Stanford. Oh yeah, Stanford. Sorry, being a Californian and I went to Berkeley. I cannot endorse Stanford. Right? So, but if you go to all 5 of those schools and you look for a personality psychologist, there has not been a personality psychologist there, a legitimate one, for the last 5 decades. So Ernst was right. He wandered over to psychology. He said, "What should I do?" And they said, "Don't invest in personality." And so he was confused by what we were showing.
So for economists, could you explain shortly the difference between the different, like, social psychology?
Okay.
Just like broadly, I think I have my own idea, but.
So personality psychologists and social psychologists study the exact same topics, and they don't get along. So, I mean, really exactly the same thing. So if you study conformity as a social psychologist, you do an experiment like an Asch experiment or a Milgram experiment to see how you can get people to conform. If you're a personality psychologist, you study the individual differences. Are there certain people who are more likely to conform? And we just don't talk to each other. We use different methods. So the experimental social psychologists will use experiments, and they'll use experiments exclusively. They'll, as you think in economics about proxies, so they'll do proxies for reality, right? They'll stick something into a lab that they can control, and it's going to be some gross distance from something that's ecologically valid. But that's okay for them because they prioritize the experiment, the manipulation.
That's a little That's a little unfair.
Nope, that's true.
We have a social psychologist.
I don't have any problem with it.
Subject to being abstract.
You want me to be nicer? I'm not going to be nice. No, I mean, they get at causal factors. So like you, they prioritize causality, right? And to do that, you have to do experiments, at least within psychology. It's unacceptable to do otherwise. We don't accept correlational or observational data, even if structured in an economics way. You can kind of get away with doing a propensity score design, and people will think that's cool, mostly because they don't understand it. But that's as far as you go, typically. So on the personality side, you're going to use observational data typically. For those of us who got into the field, I got into it because I was interested in outcomes that you're interested in. What are the psychological predictors of things like occupational success or failure, of creativity, or marital discord or marital success, which are things that I can't legitimately manipulate in a lab. If you're interested in the phenomena of human nature and its experience in a more natural setting, you tend to be more of an observational scientist, you tend to be more of a personality psychologist. But we always study the same thing, and unfortunately don't get along. So we might integrate at some point. In the non-cognitive era, which I think we can say started with Heckman, but I know the term, at least according to last night's conversation, started well before then. But definitely Heckman popularized it in a way that I think has made me be here right now. So it changed my career by a significant amount, because now I talk to you, whereas before I didn't talk to anybody, and if I did, it was a room full of psychologists. And it's been an interesting experience, trust me. But he said, look, be well-educated, smart, and have good character. Do something other than just accumulate cognitive resources or educational resources, because that's going to also affect human capital outcomes. A non-cognitive psychologist, somebody now, might say, if you at least look at the popular press, ignore rich and smart and have grit and a good mindset, right? The popular TED Talks where something like grit is as important, if not more important, than your cognitive abilities and or your education. And that's why we should make the entire country gritty, or we should give everybody a growth mindset and dedicate a tremendous number of resources to doing those things, right? That seems to be the popular fad now. These are some quotes that I like. These are just straight from the press. Perseverance was a better predictor of success than any other trait. What matters most for children are qualities such as persistence, self-control, curiosity, conscientiousness, grit, and self-confidence. There's no anti-poverty tool we can provide for disadvantaged young people that will be more valuable than the character strengths, such as conscientiousness, grit, resilience, perseverance, and optimism. So this is from Paul Tuft's book. He wrote this after hanging out with Heckman and his group for a few years when they had meetings, and derived these conclusions from those presentations. This is from a just released report from the OECD. The development of social and emotional skills is important not only for the well-being of individuals, but also for wider communities and societies as a whole. The ability of citizens to adapt, be resourceful, respect, and work well with the others, and to take personal and collective responsibility is increasingly becoming the hallmark of a well-functioning society. No mention of education, no mention of IQ. These are the non-cognitive features. So the influence of Heckman is now, let's say, propagating through policy circles. So institutions like the OECD are now very invested in trying to understand and assess non-cognitive skills so that they can use them to, let's say, predict human and social capital in other countries around the world, other than the United States. Okay, so what can I bring to this conversation? A little bit of understanding of what non-cognitive is, at least from my perspective. So I'll have some interesting comments to make about some of your presentations. Evidence for how these non-cognitive factors are related to many of the outcomes. This is going to be probably less important for you because my sense from this morning's posters are you're well versed in thinking about how these things might affect really important outcomes. I'll just show you what psychologists have been finding. Whether non-cognitive factors may qualify as forms of human capital. So can they be learned and can they be developed? So I'll concentrate on these first two things in the first hour and then the third bullet on the second hour. Okay? Any questions? Okay. I'll apologize to Julia. She was just appropriately deriding our theoretical quality in our field because this is what qualifies as a theory in psychology. Bunch of boxes and arrows. I put this up largely because this is the heuristic or organizing structure that I've used, and I use it largely as a tool I created it to help myself teach my courses both at the graduate level and undergraduate level so that I could better, let's say, organize a class and cover topics appropriately. I've found it useful at very crude levels. I'm not going to propose that there are any significant causal paths in there, but there are some distinctions that I think are important and might illuminate some of the things that you look at. So I argue that there are 4 big bins of units of analysis in at least personality psychology. The first bin is personality traits, traditionally called. Second bin is motives or values. The third is abilities, cognitive abilities. And the fourth is narratives. I'll focus on these 3 for the most part. There are obviously etiological factors that contribute to the development of these outcomes, starting with genes or heritability studies. Physiological mechanisms are supposed to subsume the new fMRI studies or epigenetic studies and things that might be developed through biological means. This is just an acknowledgement that both societies and roles within societies can contribute to the development of these things so that they can be shaped. I think the most important thing I could communicate for you is the distinction among these types of qualities. So let me talk about that a little bit. So personality traits as we define them are the relatively enduring, automatic patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And they're distinguishing each of us, and they're manifest in specific contexts. It's not a satisfactory or in any way defensible definition. I think as a field we need to do better, but this is what we're working with at the moment. There are certain qualities to this that I think are important. So the first is that for personality traits, we're talking automatic. We're not talking deliberative. So, like I always like to joke, when an extrovert enters a room, when I enter a room, I don't enter a room and go, I'm an extrovert. I therefore have a goal to talk to a person. Hello, how are you, person? You don't. This is not how human beings, act, right? A large portion of our behavior, if you believe Danny Kahneman's book, at least, well, you can believe the point, not the evidence, at least, is guided by automatic patterns that we've developed over time and habituated. When we talk about personality traits, in particular, that's what we're talking about, right? It's the way you approach social interactions, work interactions, and without thinking about it, default to something, your default settings. That's what we mean by personality traits, okay? So it's not that you can't think about them. We, as survey researchers, force our people to think about them a lot, right? Here's my big 5 inventory. Am I extroverted? Yes, no, right? So you can take a perspective on what you do and try to discern that, but that is a proxy for what we're doing. But when we think conceptually about what it is we study, this is what we're trying to get at. I didn't highlight this enough, but we can talk about it if you want. Every unit of analysis and personality can be manifest at multiple levels. One thing I notice in economics is because you're usually beholden to your data, so you're like me in some respects, you use whatever you got, right? And it's like, there's a measure. I'll say that's a proxy for conscientiousness, and you just run with it, right? I've got internalizing and externalizing disorders, which the clinicians would just have a conniption if they saw you using that as a proxy for social-emotional skills. That's psychopathology, that's not personality, that's not social. So trust me, I'm more on your camp than theirs, but if there's one thing that psychologists do is we parse, and we make divisions between our constructs and our fields. But one way to think about some of this, which is I think important for the way you view it, is you can manifest these at really concrete, really low levels, right? How I'm acting right now, or how I'm acting across the 5 presentations I'm giving in the next 2 weeks, right? Is there consistency in what I do, or am I doing something unique here, right? Trust me, I'm not. I did this on Tuesday. This is the way I present. But you can do things in a very proximal, very specific, very contextualized manner. You think about extroversion, it could be said, okay, Brent in the economics context will speak like this. Brent in the psychology context will speak a different way, right? And there's some truth to that, and the question is always what's common and what's unique, and which one is most important. As a psychologist, I ask that question of every measure I look at and want to know the answer to that, because sometimes when you use something that seems to be really specific, self-regulated learning in a classroom, it might be actually conscientiousness, which is the broader thing. In the absence of having both measures, you don't know. But then you can choose to measure things in different ways. It seems the economists have been satisfied with the argument so far, and they're using the big 5 a lot. And that's a relatively broad, less contextualized approach, which is fine, causes some people problems. There's always circularity issues, but as a proxy for what's going on with people, it's got utility, right? But you can make that choice when you design a study, and you're subject to it if you don't. Yeah.
How do you, as a psychologist, think about the stability of personality traits across a life course?
I try not to think about it, but I'll show you the data later. So, but this is a good question in this case, because the assumption is that the more specific things are less stable, and the broad things are more stable. That assumption is seldom correct, or at least correct enough for us to really bother with. What's the lifespan or the time span of what you're thinking of? If it is 30 years, like you were talking about in your study, maybe that's something you want to know. If it's 5 years, we have a nice study where we took motivational, contextualized variables and compared them to the big five. The stabilities were indistinguishable across a 4-year period in adolescence. Yeah, so, but I'll show you the data later. Good question. Okay, any other questions? Okay. You are, of course, I hope, familiar with the big five. I like the big six. So this is the big five plus honesty and humility. The pat joke I tell here is that the big five was originally identified in American research. And we only started including honesty and humility when we did cross-cultural research in Europe and other countries, where suddenly they said, hey, there's a sixth domain. It's called honesty. So, oh, okay. And are we living that now? So extroversion, which is how talkative you are, agreeableness, nice versus not nice, conscientiousness, whether you're a hard worker or not, emotional stability, which is your ability to regulate your emotions and control them, openness to experience, being creative, curious, intellectually engaged. Honesty, humility is basically being honest versus not. Though as economists, you should also know that the people who measure this also include greed avoidance. So if you want money, this is where time preference or delayed discounting should be when it's, let's say, driven by how much money you're asking people to consider. Yeah.
So, honesty and humility,
yeah.
for me, are two
Two different things. Yeah, yeah. No
things,
argument.
but
Yeah.
You measure they are one dimension, or you just lump them. I doubt that you would lump them together. Economists certainly would.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. But that's also, it's a good example of what happens when you work at such a broad level. At a very broad level, they do lump together, at least in the measures that have been developed to assess it. And I'm thinking of Hexaco and Lee and Ashton in my field who've done this, right? But we're, in this case, they're not sharpening, they're leveling. They're saying, the correlation's 0.5. I'm going to put them together. But it's a real good question in terms of how you're distinguishing it. It's also an acknowledgement of how you could go down a level or two, right? I study conscientiousness a lot, and we focus on the facets a lot. I want to distinguish, self-control, the ability to inhibit the prepotent response, from hard work, right? Grit is the hard work facet of conscientiousness. It's not the self-control facet of conscientiousness, right? And therefore, it relates to GPA, but it doesn't relate to drug and alcohol abuse as much, right? If I'm interested in drug and alcohol abuse, I'm interested in the self-control facet. So you can dive down and dig deeper and start differentiating the facets if you want.
And so most psychologists accept that there's a six, big five, big six? Is that well accepted?
Well accepted? No.
No?
No. Most of us would accept that there's five. Yeah. I know. Cattell, I think, had 15. So I think we're edging towards the big six at this point.
Okay,
so
this is changing. So
yeah, this is a new kind of consensus, but I wouldn't call it a consensus. Yeah. I think I looking at the data from my position, it's hard to rule out the honesty factor, and so I'm willing to say that you should probably think about it.
So we have experimental data on lying and honesty, and this is highly correlated with agreeableness.
Yes. That's the counter argument. The big fivers will say, stop it, you've just carved out a piece of agreeableness and put it over here. The big sixers will say, yes, but when I do experiments on things like honesty, lying, cheating, agreeableness doesn't predict it, but honesty and humility does. I'm not here as an advocate, I'm just here to tell you what they're saying.
Another argument from the lying literature is you cannot people ask if you are liar.
I know.
So, the measurement error that's
well,
within all the other.
How many of you have heard of social desirability and social desirable responding? How many of you heard of the scales that are meant to measure them? Del Paulus has 2 scales, right? It's hilarious that people are so dumb, right? I'm going to self-report my unconscious ability to lie. Okay, right? It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But if you're, so from my perspective as a psychometrician, if you see people using social desirability scales, it's an indication that they're not well trained, at least in psychometrics. Because when you start looking at the content validity of those and the validity of them, you realize, oh, you can't assess it with a self-report measure, and to be self-deceived, and you report that in a self-report measure. That's awesome, right? That just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, there's limits to our self-reports, but that's why I use observer ratings. So, okay. Motives and values. This is what you desire, what you're interested in. So you have your behavior, preference, and constraints model. In my world, I kind of view the personality traits as the constraints. If you like preferences, I know in some of the models you're not supposed to assume that they change or they vary, but I would put motives as the same thing as preferences. This is what you like. This is what you like to do. This is what you want to do. So do you want to have kids? Do you want to have a job in academia? Do you want to have a job in the private industry? Do you want to, pick up a new hobby? What will it be? Will it be cooking? Will it be gardening? Will it be some kind of exercise? These are motives from my perspective. These are the things you desire and like. And they are sufficiently distinct from the big 5 to consider them a separate domain. They are obviously related in some respects, but not usually at a level that would make them the same category, at least from a psychological perspective. So this might be probably one of the most useful distinctions I could give you in terms of what you're doing when you're measuring certain things and you're looking at it and it's a motive or desire or a question of what they want. I would put that as a separate category than the big 5. So same as traits, they can be enduring, they can be specific, just depends on how you want to manifest it. Okay, abilities you know about, so cognitive abilities, of course they can be other types of abilities, but we don't measure those well. So we've obsessed over cognitive ability because we can measure it well. And it's somewhat hierarchical, but not as hierarchical, I think, as personality and motives. Okay, so I'm going to structure the remainder of the presentation and probably whip through it pretty fast on a life course developmental model of health that we used and have been using for a couple of decades to try to understand the relationship or implications of personality for life course outcomes, especially focusing on physical health, morbidity, and also mortality. The only way to get funding in the United States to study something is to link it to health and mortality. We did that. And this gives us our understanding of how it works. So the assumption being that personality is going to be related to the life structures we build, the marriages, work, and other contexts. And it's also going to affect how you behave in relationship to health and also how healthy you are, and then subsequently whether you live longer or not. So let me show you some of that data. The first study, which I'll describe, and I'll come back to it a few times, is a Project Talent data set. Some of you might be familiar with it. It is a nationally representative sample of high school students assessed in 1960, 440,000 students in the United States, completed 4 days of assessments, an exhaustive battery of cognitive functioning, a wide array of questions about interests and activities in school, and unbeknownst to me, a personality measure. Until about 6 years ago, I didn't know that. Nobody knew that until the company that owns it, AIR, came forward and said, hey, anybody want to use this data? We've been mining it. The economists haven't picked it up, I think, because you appropriately don't like the attrition. So they didn't do a very good job on the follow-ups, and that created a situation where you go from 440,000 to 80,000. Yeah. And I've seen most economists just go, I'll just go out and do something else. We've been using the data to good effect. Ignore that top part, sorry. I just wanted to describe the personality measure. It has 10 scales. They were designed by the authors. For the most part, they measure extroversion and conscientiousness. So everything I'll show you is going to be focused on those 2 dimensions. Yes?
You just said, or you kind of criticized that economists sometimes they take this as a proxy and then they give this a label and they use it.
Mm-hmm.
This, I guess in the 1960s, the big 5 were not existing as we use them today.
Yeah.
How did you manage to call this extroversion and conscientiousness?
We did a lot of work. We validated the measure by re-administering it to a bunch of people, doing a bunch of different measures, same age groups, It's a messy measure. If you
It's far away from giving just this label. There's a lot of work until you give this label.
Yeah. And I don't want to invest in it even that much, because even after doing all the work, it's still not clear. So a lot of measures don't measure the big five. A lot of measures that measure the big five don't measure the big five. So I work with the World Bank on some of these, and this is something you should know, especially in non-educated populations. The self-report measures that we use don't work. They don't work the same way. So you'll get the big two, even though the measure says the big five. Because, and this is my interpretation, oftentimes when we ask people to report on themselves, they're not going to, it's a form of communication, right? We think, because we're well educated, and you guys are worse at this, you think people are smart and well educated. I just think people are well educated. We all project our own selves into our studies, right? And when we ask non-traditional populations to fill out these measures, they don't usually tell us about the big five. They tell us, like, I'm a good person, yeah, okay. And they'll say yes to a lot of good things and no to a lot of bad things. And when you look at the factor analysis, there's not 5 things. So you should just be aware of that, because you actually usually do use representative samples in other countries, for example, and you're not going to get something with this fine resolution. Yeah. I think it's the limits of the form of assessment that we're using. It could be. If you look at Sautier's work, he says the only generalizable structure across most of the globe is the big two. And it might be that people don't have that differentiation. We haven't done the right research to make that claim yet. We just know that when we use our typical self-reports, it's a problem. Pardon? You'd want to use a within language survey. I would actually want to get away from surveys. I'd much rather have professionals observe people and work with them and do a set of standardized tasks and see people vary about it. Those were really expensive studies, relatively hard to design. They're totally doable. We do them a lot in industrial psychology, but somebody has to fund them. And you draw somebody through some full day assessment battery of standardized situations, and that's several $1,000s typically per day. So we've had a hard time doing that. Thus, we fall back to proxies, self-report big five measures. But just be aware that we don't always get the big five when we do that. This is the relationship between personality and education in 1971. Parental SES is a nice big factor, of course. IQ is a nice big factor. Women in this stage were working less in 1971. Personality in this case had 2 beta weights, 0.08 and 0.07. A fine R squared by our standards. Everything, of course, statistically significant. This is kind of, if you look across lots and lots of studies, this is the typical pattern. If you're looking at educational attainment, it's always SES and IQ are the largest and most important. So in terms of investments, I would agree that you try to be rich yourself and that you try to make sure you marry somebody smart to guarantee your kid has some more brains. But there are some important contributions from non-cognitive factors too.
So why do you only have 47,000 observations? Just
people who are working.
8,000?
Yeah, there were a lot of people who weren't working in 1971. So some were still in school. Many of the women were not working at all. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. And the other reason was those are the men. Sorry. And these are the women. The coefficients were smaller. So, which is kind of the opposite. All the things I saw this morning were that women were affecting their kids a lot more than their daughters more than their sons. In this data, I see, but it's also Project Talent data. The coefficients for women always tend to be smaller on all the outcomes. I don't know why. In terms of, this is your influence on us. Instead of just looking at beta weights, we decided to transform the effects into tangible, pragmatic, meaningful outcomes. So we looked at numbers of months of education gained and numbers of dollars. Because 0.07s, 0.03s in my field are things you should ignore. Those effect sizes are too small. They're not meaningful, important, even if they're statistically significant. And so when we did transform things into real months and time and value, we got numbers that, at least according to our economics friends, were good, right? So IQ gets you, almost 2 years of extra education. Conscientiousness gets you about a semester, which in America could be $30,000, so that's not inconsequential, right? And then gets you $2,400 extra per year, which we at first went, but most of our economist friends said, yeah, that's good. So welcome to the real world. There is at least some evidence that our investments in the non-cognitive factors might be important, at least for outcomes like income and education. I think I messed that up, didn't I? That was income, that wasn't women, sorry. So income, at least for us, is very difficult to predict. Okay. Another study, the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health Study, which is run by Timmy Moffat and Absalom Caspi. This is a longitudinal cohort study of the citizens of Dunedin, New Zealand, that have been tracked now into their 40s. They started when they were born. And when they were young, they had lots of assessments, and Absalom and Timmy put together a paper where they combined all the assessments of what would be considered self-control into one index: teacher ratings, parent ratings, even kid ratings, and then use that age 10 index of self-control to predict things at age 32, controlling for SES and IQ. And here's just a nice overview of the financial and socioeconomic outcomes going across quintiles. Individuals in the highest quintile were about 0.8 standard deviations higher on financial success, like income, socioeconomic status, and planfulness, and they were about the same, less likely to experience financial difficulties, both from their perspective and from their friends' perspectives. This is a study from the Ad Health Dataset. This is only cross-sectional, but it was interesting because it was looking at outcomes related to more economic things. The big five have been measured once in that study, and there we found a relationship between conscientiousness and the typical indicators of financial distress: missing payments, losing phone service, missing rent, being insolvent, or suffering from food insecurity. And so personality traits are related to things that have tangible effects on people's life outcomes. In this case, the correlations in beta weights were, again, by our standards, small, but I think by your standards they were big. So my sense is that we have a different scale. Personality and relationships. This is one of our longitudinal studies on health. 3-year longitudinal study, 1,000 people, cross-sectional or cross-age cohort design. Here you find what we see in a lot of different studies. People who are more conscientious are more satisfied with their marriage, so they're happier in their marriage. And that all relates to health also. So conscientiousness contributes to your positive relationships. We consider it a hygiene factor, so you screw up less in your relationship. You put the toilet seat down, you clean up after yourself, you do things that cause less irritation, which is not a bad thing. This is a meta-analysis we did in 2007 looking at divorce and prospective relationships of divorce. And here we found that 3 of the big 5, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and agreeableness, were all positive predictors of stability in relationships. So if you'd like to invest in a stable marriage for your kids' sake, under the assumption that that's going to result in better things for them, give them a personality test, or maybe all their friends, and try to marry the ones who are conscientious, agreeable, and emotionally stable, because they're going to be less prone to experiencing divorce for whatever mechanistic reason you might come up with.
So is that is just when I am conscientious, irrespective of my
Your spouse.
partner?
Yeah, so these are all prospective studies that we could find, typically finding a specialized sample of some sort that they bothered to follow up. So it was always individuals. We have done some couples work with this, and we know, for example, that if you're married to somebody who's conscientious, your health is better. So I knew this before the study because I was married to somebody who was conscientious, and so when the data came across the table, I was like, I know what to do. There are mutual or independent effects of husbands and wives on outcomes for each other. And so we've seen that in economics and outcomes for occupations. My first study was a couples paper showing that husband's personality was just as important as wife's personality for wives' occupational outcomes. It was really good to be married to an individualistic, original man if you had a desire in 1970 to go against the norm and have a job and be successful. Yeah.
These measures in part are chosen because they predict behaviour. So there's this kind of circularity in what you're doing.
Not in these studies. These were studies.
The big five.
Oh, the big five. Yeah. Yeah. No, well, no, we're not that good, right? We don't select them based on their ability to predict behavior. We identify them. Remember, we're like geologists. We go, ooh, look, these rocks can be organized this way, these rocks can be organized that way. Our subsequent move to understanding their predictive validity was inspired by people like you and the industrial psychologists who said, hey, if you're going to keep on doing that, tell us why it's important. There is some circularity in the sense that if you're trying to look at something specifically related to conscientiousness, like I am a conscientious person, therefore I'm looking at how clean you keep your house. You would assume that they're, let's say, manifestations of the same thing. Many of these studies were done in large part because the outcome itself was not the manifestation of the trait. So divorce was chosen because divorce is not conscientiousness. Mortality was chosen because it's the end of all personality. So you can do the circularity, which I think psychologists do a lot, or you can move to other types of outcomes and try to be careful.
Follow up, this might be this, and these traits are based just purely on correlation structures in measures.
That has been the case. There are people who do other types of research to try to broaden the scope, but for the most part, that's the dominant theme within the field. So there's often a misunderstanding that we've selected the items based on the fact that they are stable. I just had this conversation 2 weeks ago in Paris, and we've never done that. So we've never gone through a set of items and looked at which ones were more stable and said, that's the personality inventory. It's really descriptive work. It's like, what things covary? Okay, cool. How do they clump? Cool. Let's figure out what's going on. That's the kind of process that's occurred. In terms of health behaviors, the big kahuna is conscientiousness. People who are more conscientious report having higher activity levels, healthy eating. So like in this domain, for example, the good studies do things like look at adherence and not self-reported adherence. They look at things like whether you actually take your medications and fulfill your prescriptions and things of that sort. And so there are some more objective studies. These individuals also don't do the things that kill people early, like drink and do drugs, drive inappropriately, have unprotected sex, have suicidal tendencies, and smoke or get in fights. Which are all the factors that contribute to premature mortality. So at least within the United States in the 1990s. So in terms of, let's say, concrete, real physiological outcomes, you can look at those. But let me get to this first. So this is the Luxembourg study looking at health outcomes across 40 years. I just wanted to introduce this because oftentimes we do use self-reports, but you do have the option to use observer ratings. And I'll make this pitch because I make this pitch at every single meeting of any organization that's trying to design a study. You have people often doing interviews. Use them. You walk into somebody's house, sit with them for 2 hours, administer a survey, you can do a big 5 rating. Because you get enough information to do it. And it's worth doing because then you get another modality. And it actually usually contributes. This study was nice because it was done with Luxembourgians, 2,800 students, which I think is half the student population in Luxembourg. And then they were followed up later. We have predictions from the teachers, parental socioeconomic status, and cognitive ability, just looking at self-related health. And here you see age 11 conscientiousness positively related to self-reported health at age 52, not necessarily mediated by educational attainment. So it's not accounted for by all the background factors or even the achievements that were happening during the life. In the Dunedin study, we did a nice study looking at concrete objective physiological indicators of health. This is the index of health we looked at: obesity, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, hemoglobin, cardiorespiratory fitness, poor pulmonary functioning, periodontal disease, systematic inflammation, CRP. We indexed this into a 12-item index of poor physiological health, used self-reports and observer ratings. So back to my point about using observer ratings, we actually used observer ratings from the staff that took the people into the study. So they didn't even interview them. They just saw them come in, interacted with them for a little bit, and then they were asked to do Big 5 ratings. Those Big 5 ratings predicted these outcomes, in addition to or independent of the self-reports. But in this case, you find an effect for openness and for conscientiousness. The people who are higher on both these dimensions tended to have fewer of these types of physiological indicators at age 38. So you can have the objective outcomes if you pursue them. So another less than desirable objective outcome is Alzheimer's. Both neuroticism and conscientiousness are predictors of Alzheimer's. Neuroticism contributes to it. Conscientiousness seems to protect. And now there are at least, I think, 10 studies that have shown this effect. There's been a meta-analysis. And the weird thing is they can't figure out why. So this is net of IQ, net of socioeconomic status, net of cardiovascular fitness, net of cholesterol. I mean, they threw everything at this possibly, and they didn't explain the effect. So they even, one of the studies is from Rush, the Rush group, David Bennett, where they ask you to donate your brain when you're done using it. Might be the most useful study you could ever participate in, right? And they even looked at the structure and physiological indicators of the actual physical brain. That didn't account for it. So something's going on with conscientious people such that they don't suffer the declines, and there, at least so far, no explanations for why. And this has been found now pretty consistently across a number of outcomes. This is the relationship between conscientiousness and neuroticism and psychopathology. So essentially, if you want to predict whether somebody is going to suffer from depression, anxiety, PTSD, social phobia, OCD, substance abuse, it's good to know what their big 5 scores are, because they're very close proxies for each other. So this could justify, for example, looking at internalizing and externalizing as proxies for the big 5, because they're capturing some of the same variants. And then mortality. This is back to the Maghreb study. So conscientiousness at age 11 is predicting mortality at age 52. And I don't have it here, but I will tell you that the teacher ratings actually predict mortality independent of the self-reports, and they both contribute at the same level. This is kind of a truism in psychology that we find a lot. When you go to a different modality, observer ratings, objective indices of a psychological function beyond self-reports, you don't get redundant variants, you get additive variants. It's its own problem, but it's also an opportunity. Okay. We did the same thing with a set of 10 adjectives in the health and retirement study with one of the subsamples. We did a mortality tracking through 2006, and there we found, of course, conscientious people tended to live longer than others. This study kind of frightens me because it was a really crappy little list of 10 adjectives that they filled out, and one of the side experiments that they did. And you can use that to predict whether somebody lived longer than somebody else. And this, of course, has been found repeatedly also. In fact, one of the first studies to wake personality psychologists up to the fact that they might be doing something serious was a 93 study by Friedman, which showed that conscientiousness predicted mortality. And now this has been shown. Pardon? It's pretty big, like a 0.2 beta weight, which is too big in some respects, because if you average the beta weights across, or the correlations across, it's usually about a 0.07 to 0.08, which is still bigger than SES, still bigger than IQ. So if you're really interested in mortality, personality is a better predictor of that. If you're really interested in divorce, personality is a better predictor of that. Educational attainment, IQ is still good, and socioeconomic background. So, but for certain outcomes, personality is much better. Let's do that. Okay, so back to my original little heuristic. I've focused primarily on traits for these things because that's what we do. Recently, we've decided we should probably try to figure out what's going on here and whether there's something important in the domain of motives in addition to what you see with the big 5. So this is a study that came out in 2016. We looked at vocational interests. So this is the Tosca longitudinal study. It's a 10-year study of gymnasium students from Germany. Started well before they went into university and has tracked them now into their real life beyond university. About 1,500 students participated in this. Vocational interests were assessed. So I thought about these in relationship to some of the presentations. The vocational interests have been assessed primarily in educational psychology, and they have lived a life separate from the big 5. And they're direct reflections of your interest in doing things and preferences for doing things. So they're objectively a preference measure. They're primarily focused on industrial and occupational type things, right? And they're used typically to guide students to make decisions about what job they should have. It's organized into 6 domains, kind of like the Big Five, but they're not the same as the Big Five. So realistic jobs are farming, investigative are science jobs like the ones you're going into, artistic jobs are artistic creative jobs, enterprising jobs are business enterprises and management and leadership. Social jobs are like being a teacher and doing something with sales, and then conventional folks are the accountants, and they just want to deal with data. So those are the 3 or 6 domains in the RIASEC model, used widely to guide students, but almost never used to predict outcomes. And so we dropped them into a study in which we had IQ and the Big Five and asked, do these things predict outcomes too? And we found that they did. This is going to be too small for you to see. So this is the personality category. This is the interest category. If you want to know whether somebody is employed full-time, vocational interests are far more important than the Big Five. So the folks in this sample who are realistic are employed sooner and more stably than the people who, let's say, were not realistic. Artistic folks, they're not employed very often, right? Then they're experiencing a lot more unemployment. No big surprise there. Hope your kids don't want to go into art school. Enterprising folks, they were more likely to be full-time employed. They're more likely to earn more money. And in a couple of different ways of looking at it. Again, if you wanted to look at income's far more important, or interests are far more important than the Big Five for predicting those types of outcomes. If you're interested in occupational outcomes, which I assume most of you are, you might want to entertain the possibility of measuring vocational interests as opposed to just the Big Five. Now, I was thinking in terms of some of the stuff you were talking about, the transmission of conventionality. So the measure you used said, I want to be in a job that gives me a steady income right now. That's a conventional person. And a conventional person might also be someone, or conventional or realistic, they might also be somebody who are more willing to be punitive. So these are also potential confounds in the studies you're doing.
Do you control for the field of study that they entered? Because like that is also correlated with income.
Right. We did that in a subsequent part, but I'm not showing you. Sorry. I thought this was too small to begin with.
So does it even hold within occupations? So does the accountant who's more conventional make more money than the less conventional?
We didn't do that. Yeah, too small of a grouping. Okay. For marriage, social people get married more than other people. Investigative people, you folks, don't get married as much as other people, or you do so later. Having children, if you want to know who has children, extroverted people do. You extroverts are causing trouble for yourself, right? You're getting in relationships, you're having more kids, and social people, which is an interest, which is independent of extroversion, is also resulting in more kids. If you're enterprising, you're having fewer kids. If you're investigative, you're having, oh no, that's not right. Conventional, you're having more kids. So if you want to look at those kind of concrete outcomes, the vocational interests are more important. If you want to look at health outcomes, the Big Five is more important. Yeah.
Sorry, why are the things that are bolded are, how should I read this?
Those are the ones where the confidence interval doesn't include 0 or 1 in this case, because it's a hazard ratio. Yeah. Okay. Okay, back to Project Talent. We did the same thing, predicting educational attainment. Sorry, when I did the men-women thing, I was misremembering this. So I broke this out by men and women because it works differently for men and women. So again, being born to a good family that has high SES gets you more educational attainment. Being conscientious, being extroverted, the same thing. The beta weight for science is actually bigger. So in 1960, if you're a man, you're going to get a PhD because you're going to go on into a kind of an engineering, physics, hard science type occupation. Social things don't work, cognitive ability does. For women, you get a similar profile, but a negative effect for being interested in people. That's much bigger than for the men.
Just out of curiosity, how do you conceptualize socioeconomic background in these studies?
In this study, it's actually really nice. It's done with an exhaustive index that not only does education, income, prestige of the job, but also those indirect indicators, number of books on the shelf, and the home type indicators. The Project Talent people did a very nice job of assessing it. But as you know, it's a controversial topic. As a personality psychologist, I like to use an exhaustive index.
Yeah, so if you would have used education?
Yeah, then you're doing the same thing twice. Yeah, no, it was the other thing. Okay, so this is just to show you that vocational interests are a potential other domain that you may want to invest in as a researcher. Okay, and then to end, at least, because there's lunch, our latest work has identified the fact that there are things beyond the Big Five and vocational interests that you may want to keep an open mind about, right? So we have a study we just published where we showed that student behaviors in classrooms predict above and beyond the Big Five and IQ and socioeconomic status for outcomes like educational attainment in the Maghreb study. So what you did as a student might be important. This is one of my favorite findings from the Project Talent outcome. What's the best predictor of the number of children you have 10 years, 11 years after graduating from high school?
Are you a man or a woman?
It works much better for a woman. Education? Okay. No? Well, yeah, that's pretty good. Sorry, psychological construct, not sociological.
As a psychologist, what about measures of well-being or happiness? Is that, in your view, is that rather an outcome, or is that there are happy people and there are unhappy people and it's a personality trait?
If I'm going to be a personality psychologist, I'm going to measure extroversion and neuroticism and be done with it. You can measure well-being, but it's usually construed as a more environmentally susceptible construct, right? It also is the case that if you ask about self-esteem and well-being, you get typically a composite of the Big Five, all the positive things. Depending upon how you measure it, it can be variable. If you do the daily reconstruction approach, for example. If you do the SWILS, the Subjective Well-Being Scale by Diener, it's going to correlate, you know this better than me, 0.5 with all the positive Big Five at any given time. But again, it depends on what level of analysis you're interested in. So to cut to the chase, really cool predictor of how many kids you have 10 years after high school is how many dates you had in high school. So if you were dating a lot in high school, you're more likely to have kids. Yeah. Aiding and abetting the process, opportunity costs, I don't know. Yeah. So, but this is just to highlight the fact that even, though we, well, yeah, some of them could have dropped out, but not all of them. Some of them might have dropped out because of that. So this is just to highlight the fact that even though we have the Big Five and we have ridiculously exhaustive measures of the Big Five, and I just sold you on using vocational interests, there still may be things beyond those two things. Yeah.
So I'm curious as to how you think about this in terms of how these traits may evolve over the life cycle, because we think of them as some tendencies that are somehow fixed, but at the same time, surely maybe the arrival of children could really affect how conscientious you are. Maybe you were really different before, but now you have this period.
Can we answer that after lunch?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Because that's what the whole second half is about, which is, in my mind, much more interesting. So I don't, it's 12:06. I've got, kind of summary slides, but we could end. Or do you want me to? Oh, we have to 12:30? Oh, cool. Sorry, I thought it was 12. Never mind. Okay. So just to I can bore you for even longer. You didn't know I was sadistic. So just to summarize, we have pretty good correlational evidence, predictive, longitudinal predictive prospective studies to kind of back up the idea that personality in multiple manifestations, personality traits, vocational interests, seem to be related to or can predict downstream effects that we all care about. How much education our kids get, whether they're going to have a happy marriage or not, whether they're going to be successful in their work, how much income they'll earn, how many kids they have, right? All the things that we think are important and all the things that we might, let's say, invest in. Some of unavoidable facts, that which predicts depends a lot on that which is being predicted. So there's there's a tendency to say conscientiousness is the most important thing possible. It's unavoidable that conscientiousness predicts lots of different things well. Conscientiousness and neuroticism, in my mind, are the big two that you should kind of always include. But conscientiousness doesn't predict, for example, income very well at all, which really makes people upset, right? It should. Hardworking people should be earning more money. Well, hardworking people also are conventional people. Conventional people sometimes gravitate to realistic and conventional jobs because they're predictable. and consistent, and they let them clean up and organize things, right? And that means lower salaries. So the kind of presumption that those things should be universally good for all outcomes is not the case at all. Obviously, neuroticism is related to all forms of psychopathology. And if you're interested in that and the consequences economically for populations, that's the domain you want to do. But if you're interested in creativity and creative output, innovation, openness would be the place to go. Extroversion has lots of interesting, different, variable relationships, oftentimes with things like health, because extroverted people tend to be more energetic. Agreeableness, on the low end, is a really nice predictor of delinquency and, let's say, counterproductive activity. And so, so each of these things will predict different outcomes depending upon what it is. There's not a universal, like, you should measure this. It's one argument for using the Big Five in whatever you're doing, but you can also be selective based on the research that's been done. Maybe this is controversial. So from our perspective, what I've shown you is at some level unimpressive. Keeping in mind the history of my field was one in which they said that a correlation of 0.3 is something you should ignore. We know better now. I mean, we know that was a silly thing to say. It was said by Walter Mischel back in 1968. And we know that's not true. We know that's not true because we've looked at utility outcomes that you have taught us to do, right, and found that, correlations are really crude indices of the importance of something. You really want to look at what counts: mortality, income, number of years married, things that actually affect people's lives. When you do that, there's not a one-to-one relationship, right? But from our perspective, if you look at the, let's say, multivariate space, there's no one big predictor. They're all relatively small, and they're all contributing in some way. So let me just get it. So I used to call this the death by 1,000 cuts model of personality, but somebody told me that was too negative. So I transformed it into the human tapestry model of functioning, that life is a little more like a tapestry than it is other things, and there's lots of threads, and that you pull on one thread, it's not going to change the whole tapestry, it'll affect it, right? That's what we're finding, at least from the psychological literature. When you see those headlines saying, or like even Paul Tuff's quotes, the best thing you could give poor people is grit. No, that's stupid, right? I mean, it could help, but it's not going to transform populations. It's not going to recreate things. So when you see the TED Talks and the science papers and the PNAS papers that oversell a construct or an idea because in one study it predicts things really well, ignore it. Because if you look across the body of research, it seems everything contributes a little bit to the picture. And I think that's the best version of human functioning we can work with from a pragmatic and a policy standpoint.
So one thing I was always surprised about is that somehow you look at these facets individually. So because surely it matters a lot whether you're conscientious and open to new experiences, or if you're conscientious but not. I mean, it's a bit like what you alluded to earlier. This might drive you to completely different careers, and that is. So, but why are people not doing this? Because it's not so like you could, right? In principle, just put people into different groups and think, because the predictive power might be much higher.
So there are a couple of sociological factors going on here. So one is just in the last 10 years, for the most part, you have noticed us, and survey folks have noticed us. And so they started inserting, measures of the Big Five and other personality traits into the SUP, into the HRS, into the British Household Panel Study, into the Ad Health. What's the one in Australia? The HILDA, right? And whenever they ask us, hey, we'd like to measure the Big Five, and we want to do it in 15 questions. Our ability to do the faceted stuff goes away. And so I have yet to convince a group to measure personality with 150 questions. When I can do that, it'll be good. But I think it's a great question, but we have to invest in it. And so far, we haven't been in control of it enough to be able to do that. So, yeah.
So how many questions, so you have said a couple of times that you should ask about these things if you have a survey, but how many questions do you need at least to be able to say something about the traits?
There's a new measure called the BFI2, which is pretty good, and it has 60 questions. It gets 3 facets for each of the Big Five. Not complete coverage of each of the Big Five by my standard, but enough to at least say, if you have flavors of neuroticism or flavors of conscientiousness combining with something like openness, you could actually look at it. It takes about 10 minutes, right? Yeah, I think. So it's a long time by survey standards, I guess. Really short time by our standards.
But 60 questions, that's
Yeah.
something like,
Yeah.
okay.
That's a lot.
I know, but from I mean, if you take a full NEO, which is 250 questions, you know, that takes about a half an hour. Oh, I know, but the part of the problem again is that these are proxies or self-report, verbal, oral, interview questions essentially, and it's not a great way to get at personality. It's the best. It's not the best we have either. It's the most expedient and most widely used. You really want to do it well, ask a lot of questions. Again, conditional on who the population is. If you're doing a non-traditional sample, don't do 250 questions because they'll fatigue. If you're doing a well-educated sample, what we find out is, especially with college students, you do 250 questions, the responses get more reliable as they go through because they start figuring out what you're asking. And they go, oh, they want to know whether I'm hardworking. Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. And so there's some utility to the combination and the length when there's a motivated, verbally fluent population. But when it's not, they'll just check out. So it's this cost-benefit analysis. So I think I did that. Needs. So this is already, I think, something we've intimated, or at least from my position. We really need better tools. So I know that we provide you with these exhaustive measures of the Big Five and argue you should have 60 questions and da-da-da-da. I really think we're at a point in history where we can start thinking much more creatively about how we assess people. You know that, sorry if I can borrow this, these things are ubiquitous if you're not on them now, and that they can be used for lots of different things, right? One of them is assessing who you are. And they can be done relatively unobtrusively, right? If you think about it, you could just ping somebody every few days and ask them, instead of 60 questions at one sitting, a couple of questions, right? And then get a much better bead over time on who somebody is and what they're doing than these retrospective reports that we do. But we really need to start thinking creatively about how we're approaching this enterprise. We should not be satisfied with survey questions. We should try to do things across modalities. If we can come up with the adult version of the marshmallow test or things like that, we should really invest some money in doing that, because while we're getting enough evidence that these things matter, the circularity problem is there, the problem with using the verbal medium is there, and that's not the same thing as personality, right? Personality is what you do and how you think and how you feel moment to moment, day to day, as you live your life. Your reports on that using 60 questions, it's a real rough proxy. So we should do better.
How do we know, maybe I should relate it, how do we know if it is accurate? Back to Jack's question, does it predict behavior? I actually don't know what in your opinion makes a good measure of personality.
Well, presumably you would have it conditional on predicting behavior. When we've done the studies, if you do something like an experience sampling method, where, for example, you ask people each day, do you clean your room? Are you organizing your things? Are you using a calendar? Conscientious people say that, right? And they do those things. So when we do the behavioral studies, these do pretty well. The correlations are more like 0.5. What is accuracy is a really nice question, because it's not an easy question to answer. Is my opinion of you the right and most accurate thing, or is your opinion of you, right? In some domains, like your neuroticism, you might be a better source of that information than me. I might not notice when you're anxious. When you're anxious, you might just be quiet, right? And so I won't be able to observe it. But you can tell me, inside I'm a boiling mess and I'm really anxious, right? Or inside I'm calm and cool and don't have any issues. So in the absence of putting people in kind of experimental settings where we get to manifest these things, which again are doable, we call them assessment centers, they're just very expensive and difficult to run. They work, but again, putting somebody through something for 8 hours in a day, for most of us is not a possibility. For the educational folks, I think it's actually a real opportunity, because you can do that in a day in a classroom, right? So that's an opportunity, I think. But we really need to attend to those. But for the most part, these self-reports predict behavior as well as you can. Observer ratings, as I noted, are usually related to but independent in consequence for self-reports. We need, oh, sorry. Okay. Right now, as we stand, we don't have tools that are fully cross-culturally comparable. Within countries, all the measures seem to work in the covariance space. Covariances seem to be incredibly robust. You want to predict income, educational outcomes, divorce, those things seem to be clear. It'll work just as well in Japan as it does in Paraguay. If you want to compare the means, you can't. At this point, just don't. I know that like the OECD and the World Bank like to produce league tables for PISA and all those different comparisons. The comparability of non-cognitive measures across these countries is so suspect at this point that you really can't do it. There are scale usage issues. For example, Confucian societies tend to not use the extremes, so they're automatically not going to be as high. The Japanese seem to be incapable of saying anything nice about themselves. Seriously. Every single study, they come out the worst on every single outcome. The Japanese people are far less conscientious than the Americans. Not stereotyping or anything, but I have doubts about that finding, right? Within Japan, if you want to predict educational outcomes, conscientiousness works great. But you're just never getting above a 4 on a 5-point scale, right? Whereas the Americans are never below 3 because they're always hardworking. So the covariances work, but the means don't. So and I was talking to Julie about it last night, it could be as simple as the translations are problematic. It could be, again, just the use of self-reports in these big retrospective descriptions are just problematic in a cross-cultural space. We need something else in that space.
And within populations, when people think about different reference groups, so if you have like you live in a very homogeneous community, then you just...
Right. It's an open question right now to what extent there are framing effects. And there are obvious framing effects across cultures. So we're playing with the PISA data. There's a conscientiousness measure in the 2012 data set. And across countries, you get a negative relationship between conscientiousness and math achievement. Once you break it out by country, it's all positive across the whole thing. So there's this framing effect, right? But then you can reorganize the data by cultural groups, 9 of them, and get the same thing. So within all of Asia, it's positively related to math achievement. So I don't know what the framing effect is. The framing effect at the specific level, we just ran some numbers for educational settings in Germany. The ICC is 0.06, 0.07. It's relatively small, but it's there. So there are some framing effects, undoubtedly, or reference group effects. They're not as large as they are for other phenomena like the big fish, little pond effect. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, where your confidence is lower if you're in a high functioning group. So there it's pretty robust. It's not as big as that. How big it is, we haven't really done the good work yet.
But it might depend on the way you ask the questions, right? Whether you ask someone, I'm a very hardworking person, or if you ask someone whether they have cleaned up their room every day.
Every day, yeah. Well, case in point, there was a woman, Laura Raman, who did a study where she asked the Asian American students, said, compared to other Asian Americans, where are you? They were low. Compared to your Caucasian friends, where were you? On conscientiousness. It's like, no, those people can't do a thing, right? And so you can ask the questions, you can recast the frame if you want to. But they haven't followed up to see which one's more valid, which would be a nice thing to do. I hope I've sold you on the possibility to expand the construct space. I know that you're like me, that you end up using the data that gets collected. But if you have the opportunity to advise on how to structure a new survey and what to include, consider the possibility of including at the very least a 25-item vocational interest measure, which I can give you, right? Especially if you're interested in occupational outcomes, because that's going to work much better than the Big 5. And it's modestly interesting too. And it's been used in lots of different ways. But I think lots of you use lots of different measures, internalizing, externalizing, well-being, locus of control. These are all valid, viable constructs that can be used in conjunction with this. And we should always keep an open mind to the possibility.
So does it mean that the personality traits don't predict your vocational interests?
They relate. So like the openness domain and the artistic interest domain, really highly related. But they're not correlated enough to be redundant. And so again, when you ask the question, what are you interested in, what do you want to do, it's just not as highly related to what you do, typically, as you would expect. Some of it has to do with the way you ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, like some of the openness items are like, I
They're
am
just-
interested in art and
Right,
museums
right.
and so on. That's like an obvious overlap in the construct.
Right, right. So the personality psychologists are utilitarian. They're kind of, they vacuum up everything. So you can see in the item sets, if you look at them closely, not the shorter Big Five measures, but the longer ones, that they'll often have preference questions, attitude questions, and behavior questions, right? All wrapped up in there in a big fat mess. And that's not good. I mean, we really do need to refine these things in a way that's informed, let's say, by models. So I was just having a conversation with an educational economist about how do we partition the space more like what economists would do. We'd look at it more like skills and abilities, right? If you're going to look at the Big Five domain as skills and abilities, you're going to go about asking the question in a different way. You're not going to ask, are you interested in art? You're going to say, are you good at art? Yeah, which is a different thing. And so we have a lot of work to do on our side to organize our house a little bit more, look at the rocks a little differently. So, yeah.
So how do you construct those measures? So if you ask 200 questions, do you take the average score, or do you use...
Which measures are we talking about?
Like personality measures, like if you...
Like the 60 items.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How do you construct those measures?
Well, I mean, if you go to the ones that exist, they already have a scoring protocol. So they've constructed them into different domains. So you could use those. You could let the data speak and see what happens in your data set. And both are viable and probably appropriate.
Okay, so there's not a consensus, like this is how it should be done.
I just expressed my opinion.
Yeah.
So if I'm an author of the test, they're going to say, here's the scoring key, use that.
Yeah.
As a researcher, I would say...
How do you make the scoring key?
Oh, it's the mean, yeah.
Okay.
Or if you're an IRT person, you can score it with an IRT system. You can weight it if you want. For the most part, if you want cross-study replicability, the mean is fine, if not optimal. So, yeah.
These vocational measures you use, how do you guys see where they come from? Like what determined them? Can they be changed?
Yeah, so the same questions, so they're lagging behind personality traits by about 2 decades. So because they got given over to the educational psychologists, it kind of was. There was like, okay, you guys take that. They were only used in these kind of counseling vocational settings. And so literally people that I know are just now tracking longitudinal changes in these to ask, how do they change? Just saw a paper presented on Tuesday down in Tübingen, where Bart Ville, who's a Belgian researcher, showed the longest longitudinal study I've ever seen from age 20 to 42. And like other goals that we've measured, the interesting thing is they go down. So most people become less interested in multiple domains as they age, which according to Paul Baltes is perfectly appropriate, right? Because you should be focusing more on what you want to do and not on what you don't want to do. And you'll see it's much different with the Big Five. So, but they're literally just starting to do those things. We know from prior work that vocational interests are more stable at a younger age than personality traits. And like everything else, they're partially heritable and they seem to develop. But we haven't done the work. Sorry. Because we haven't hung out with you guys enough. I mean, you know how it works. It's tribal, and so how many economists show up at my group and talk to psychologists? How many psychologists come? So like when you came, when we had that meeting this winter, I mean, you're probably one of the first economists I've ever heard say, hey, I've got this really cool survey of economic preferences. Let's do that. We've had conversations, the typical measures that you like, time preference and the like, tend to be so laden with cognitive ability that they become uninteresting to us. Because... Yeah. We looked at economic outcomes. Yeah. Wages, unemployment. Yeah. Do some kind of horse race between, say, Big Five. Yeah. Focus of control, and it turns out they are complements. Right. Right. Right,
finding.
right.
Even if you use a 60-item version, I mean, a 15-item version in the ZERP, I agree, is probably, it's not hard to beat. But even if you use 60 items, and, really nice IQ tests and complex and synthesis, there's some complementary expansion as well. And I'm just a little surprised that people, I mean, we've been so open, right?
Yeah.
Taking your items for decades, but you have.
I stand accused. And part of the problem, I think, at this point is demographic. There's not enough of us. So my tribe especially is relatively small. And what's happened in the last decade is you started measuring all these things, and we went, holy cow, this is great. I don't have to collect data because I've got the GSUP and I've got all these different data sets. And if you look at my people, who do personality work, the Rich Lucases, Brent Donnellans, Julia Auroras of the world, they've said, ooh, the economists are starting to collect this data. That's great. And every graduate student I have now comes through and it's like, should I collect more data or should I, there's the MIDAS study in the United States. It's a 3-wave longitudinal study with a personality measure and a whole bunch of stuff we're interested in. Should I use that? Or should I use the HRS, which is now a cross-cohort sequential design with multiple waves of longitudinal data that show development and change and relationships to hard outcomes. So I'm going to blame you. Your data that you've collected is too good. But I totally agree with you that there should be better communication. We tried, as you know, with the Heckman meetings, and I brought in all the personality folks, and you're right. They didn't say, cool, I'm going to use economics thinking or measures. I'd much rather, to be honest with you, that we adopt the way you approach work than we use your measures, because you do a much better job of being systematic with causality, with the implications of your studies, trying to really figure out whether that relationship is robust, right? We're very much like, look at that. It's significant. And then we wander off to the next project. So.
That's another thing I'd like to ask maybe is interesting, get your opinion on, which is, I mean, some people are somehow trying to maximize R squared. Right?
Yeah.
And finding maybe sometimes selectively items that happen to correlate well.
Mm-hmm.
I think there were some questions before that go in actually this direction.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose you have a trade-off between a well-defined measure.
Yeah.
I think that is actually a distinctive difference between economics and personality psychology. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but the economic notion of preferences is at least rooted, say, right? So it's a utility framework, and we have some understanding what they are supposed to measure, right? Whether they exist or not is a different issue, but there's some theoretical underpinning in understanding and interpreting this measure, right? In fact, some of the personality psychology measures are kind of ad hoc,
Right.
Vocational interests, where is this coming from, and how is this rooted in some methodological consumption background.
Yeah.
So, if you had if you were to solve a trade-off with one measure clearly defined, well understood, rooted in say some conceptual framework with an R squared 0.1 versus some ad hoc combination of measures, and many economists are actually using psychology exactly that way. We should talk about this openly. What many people call social emotion is just garbage, right? Because they just collect what's out there. It's, they take smoking, they take all kinds of things.
Proxies. I can't give you flack for using proxies. I use proxies all the time.
What does explaining mean?
Right.
Even if I have a paper that say R squared 0.5, that looks awesome, but
Mm-hmm.
what have I, in terms of understanding, I don't even know where I have been moving.
Yeah.
And how could this insight be transported to another context, another issue already in paper and so forth? So, maybe you can talk a bit about, disciplining ourselves, using it.
Yes. sorry, I'm tired. Wikipedia just said I'm 68, so I'm going to like to say I don't have another career in me. But obviously you're correct in the sense that we need to better articulate the theoretical models. That's one reason I'm trying to work with some of the economists to compare and contrast. And it is the case that psychologists tend to be pragmatic and utilitarian, giving themselves up to factor analysis to find out what it is. But it is also the case that there are people who work on very theoretically well-informed ideas that could then inform measures, right? And so it's possible, it's been done. It hasn't been done for these broad taxonomies of things, but it could be. So I don't think there's a lack of willingness on the part of the psychologist. I think your utilitarian approach is also a tragedy because we've done that too. One of the longest traditions in personality psychology was the empirical tradition, where we would throw 450 items at populations and then see whether they differentiated people who were schizophrenic from people who were not. And that created the first personality measure, which was the MMPI. And it worked. It predicted outcomes. There was a socialization scale from the CPI made the same way. It predicted whether you were a criminal better than any measure in history, period. And why? Because it was made by predicting whether you were a criminal. And absolutely atheoretical. And what was really fun about those approaches is they always tend to be somewhat economical and multifaceted. So in those situations, wherever you care about something like income or divorce or some concrete thing, it's never singular, right? There's always multiple things that contribute to it. And that's nice. And you can use that to your advantage. You can create measures to maximize your prediction of income. I was playing with OECD data that they collected across 8 countries where they had good income data and about 150 items. And I said, okay, which items predict income? There are about 5 across every single country that predicted income. A little mix of extroversion and neuroticism in those samples, right? So I could maximize my utility in terms of assessments by sticking with those 5. And we could do that together in a very constructive way. It's totally atheoretical, but still possible. If you look at the PISA data, the persistence measure that was put in there, it predicts math achievement across every country. Really what's going on is one item predicts math achievement across all those countries. It's the item that says something to the effect, when things get difficult, I give up. That's 80% of the validity of the 5-item measure that goes. So you can do that, I think, and it's often useful. It's still an empirical dust bowl, but we're also okay with that. We got bashful after Freud, I think. So let me just try to counter your social-emotional skills are garbage. Well, no, I mean, so there's a political issue and there's a pragmatic issue, right? Politically, it's not tenable to go to many constituencies and say you're going to measure personality. Educational practitioners and researchers will not suffer it. One reason they love grit is because it was packaged as a non-trait. And so for them, it's okay to do. The term social-emotional skills, social-emotional resources, 21st century skills, character, strengths, all these different things, these are all terms used because people don't want to say personality, okay? I'm here to say that you can do that. It's fine. So here's my working taxonomy of social-emotional skills. Leadership. We should develop our kids to be good, right? We should teach them to be competent leaders, stand up in front of a group and give a speech. Teamwork. They need to be able to work together, right? Work with each other, solve conflicts, negotiate in a constructive fashion without ruining NATO. Sorry. Work ethic, right? They need to at least be able to show up at work and get their job done. That's what we want. Bare minimum. Resilience. Everybody's going to get stressed. The requirement in society is that you figure out how to deal with it, even if it means checking out. Creativity, curiosity, critical thinking. We need people to create new things. We need them to think systematically. Honesty and integrity. It's good not to lie, right? Exactly. These are social-emotional skills, Professor. They are exactly social-emotional skills, and they are exactly the big 6. Exactly. No, I mean, to be honest with you, this isn't a transparently Machiavellian thing. I was putting together all of the descriptions of the necessary social-emotional skills identified by a number of groups that in the last decade have identified them. So NRSA or NSA, I'm sorry, there's a number of different organizations that have put out reports that have said, these are the things we need to invest in. These are the things they said they need to invest in. The different facets you see underneath there, those are the facets from the BFI too. So those are the facets of the Big Five or the Big Six. And so we are talking about the same thing. We can be talking about the same thing. We need to do some work to get there, but there's the possibility of actually seeing some integration. So we can make what's called social-emotional skills something constructive. But so I really do think the Big Six is a good organizing framework. You can make a choice about how you package it and how you assess it.
I was criticizing psychology. I was criticizing some of our colleagues. Basically due to data restrictions, I guess. Sometimes arbitrarily take some stuff which has a social-emotional flavor, call it a social-emotional skill, and then from there on, use it in whatever they do, and then they explain something. I'm not exactly sure what that object is. That is supposed to explain what is it really, or how could I generalize that finding from the other situation? What does it mean in the first place? And of course, I mean, coming back to what you're saying, if I want to predict whether someone is wearing a green hat, right, I'm asking that person, are you wearing a green hat? And then I probably get a pretty good prediction. Right?
Yeah.
How interesting is that? And what is it? What is the object that you're really interested in? I thought it's something like, assume there's some like personality, let's measure it, and then see, tying our hands, these are our measures, and what is the predictive power, right? And then we know how much personality actually predicts. And now, here's an outcome that we're interested in. How could we derive a personality scale that is so closely related that we can have a hope that it has a high correlation with these newly developed items.
So one of the practices that we engage in when confronted with samples of convenience or panel data, we do a lot of digging up data from the past, like the Project Talent study. It's just basically run a side validation study. The Maghreb study that's what we did. We did that with Project Talent. So instead of saying, this is a social-emotional skill or a personality trait or a motivation or whatever it is, we just, it's not hard to do. I mean, and you can do that as a supplement to any of the big studies with the panel survey systems we have now and MTurk and all those things. You can get very fast data on the construct validity of your measure and at least have some sense. I'm not calling it a theory, but I'm going to say that a lot of what we do ends up being from these domains of the Big Five. It probably is in your best interest to know which domain it's from. And it's not a hard piece of data to get. So you can work diligently, hard, and for years on a really nice study looking at the causal relationship between education and outcomes for kids, right? And then look at the measure and say, well, I've got internalizing and externalizing. What's that related to? Now, in this case, you don't need to do the study because other people have already done it, right? But there might be proxy measures that you're using. It's just not that hard to do. That would be a nice complement. Not theoretical by any means, but I think the Big Six is pretty good working structure, at least for most of the social-emotional skills that we employ, with the exception of vocational interests.
Why there's a stigma that you call it this personality, measuring personality?
What's the most changeable thing in your kids going forward? Is it their social-emotional skills, their cognitive abilities, or their personality? When asked by OECD, a group of 1,000 parents said the least changeable thing is their kid's personality. And you'll see in the next presentation that it's not true, but trust me, I can't even convince my colleagues after 20 years of showing them that personality traits change to accept the fact that personality traits change. So there's a very strong lay personality theory that which doesn't change is your personality.
It's not just lay theory.
I know.
Model is non-changing.
Well, no, because actually, well, sorry,
At age 30.
you're giving away that you're young. So those of us who are a little more chronologically challenged know that before 1980 and Costa McRae, psychologists accepted the fact that personality traits changed. There are whole books on how to change personality. It was widely accepted, not in the least bit problematic. You did have the psychoanalytic folks, which were weird. They said personality was fixed by age 5 because you solved your Oedipal complex. We don't even think about them anymore, right? But the idea of changeability became really anathema. And I think I like the anecdote that we had from one of our longitudinal studies. We asked people after 5 years, how's your personality changed in the last 5 years? And one of the individuals responded, my personality hasn't changed at all. I've become more conscientious, I work harder, and I'm much less anxious than I was before. But my personality hasn't changed at all. It illustrates kind of perfectly the nature of the incongruity, right? I think we can possess this idea that what's core me is core me and is not going to go anywhere. And at the same time, accept that your personality is changing, but you just define it differently. And so when you confront different groups, especially educators, the last thing they want to do is work on the students' personalities, right? Even though they all argue that that's the biggest challenge they face. Does the kid sit in his chair? Do they disrupt? Do they throw things? Do they do their work on time? You get teachers who complain about those things. When you say, oh, that's conscientiousness, they say, no, it's not, right? And even if you say, well, we could do something about that, they say, I don't want to hear about it, because you're blaming the victim. And it's a really hard political battle to win. I have not won it yet. And so when you invoke the terminology, you invite the repercussions. And it is a marketing campaign. Angela Duckworth is more famous than almost any psychologist I know. And she relabeled conscientiousness, right? And she marketed it in a different way. I've had academics argue to me that grit is changeable. If you look at the items on the grit scale, it is conscientiousness. I mean, it's like verbatim items from the scales I use, right? And all she did was go into it with a different angle, and these groups said, oh yeah, I mean, educators love her. I love her too, she's really nice, but I'm just saying, it's a really nice nugget of how the topography of the politics can be really diametrically different depending on how you start. And I know as a personality psychologist and as somebody who has spent his career trying to, I've been studying personality development primarily and finding that it changes and showing people how it does, it hasn't had a notable effect on the broad field. I think we'll get there by the time I'm 80. That at least the field will say, yeah, that's probably true. But if you can figure out a way to increase the utility of personality change, I'm all ears. Okay. Okay, to all those people that I put off when it came to those really cool questions about whether personality can change or is changeable, let me say that this is primarily what my research is about and has been about. It's been my prime interest. So this part of the presentation will focus on those issues. So the goals I have are, one, to present at least an overview of the latest data and research that we know about when it comes to personality development and change. Along the way, I'll report some new data, tracking one of the longest longitudinal studies ever done, so that we have really kind of robust data on the biggest question. And then I'll give you the opposite, which is kind of the shortest study that's ever been done, looking at whether seeing a therapist has a tangible effect on personality trait change in particular, and then some follow-ups of some of those studies that we've done. So I'll kind of go on both sides of the equation. You got a question? No? Okay. Along the way, I'll try to provide some perspectives on personality development. So this gets fundamentally to the policy level question of whether psychological variables and personality traits in particular are human capital, right? Because I think the assumption, given the definitions of human capital that I've seen, say that it's something that can be trained and or taught. Back to our earlier conversation about the politics of personality, the assumption that it's fixed would make it a non-starter for most policy level implications, right? If you can't change it, you can't develop it, then why should we actually go after it? So it really is a question of whether it's exogenous or endogenous, and the changeability is key to that. The other thing it relates to, and this is some of the side conversations we've had, is it something trainable? Is it a skill, right? Or is it some entity that can't be changed? If it is changeable, then it could be a skill. It's something that could be put into part of the curriculum. Teachers could train it, or you could go to job coaching or whatever you want to do. Okay, So what do we know about the long-term stability of personality traits? We know a lot because stability of personality is fundamental to the definition. So personality psychologists have over-analyzed this. So we did a meta-analysis in 2000. This was 152 studies. Really, it was more about 200 studies. Personality psychologists love test-retest stability of things. So they will report it over and over and over again. So it was not hard to do. And the findings were innocuous and surprising simultaneously. So these bars represent the average stability going from 0 to 1 for different age groups, 0 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 18, college students, 22 to 30, 40, 50, 60. So each of these bars actually represents, in some respects, a separate meta-analysis in each of these age groups. As you can see, stability of personality marches up and peaks in the 50s at about 0.75. When raw, when disattenuated, it's about 0.85. I like raw correlations better for a variety of reasons. But the first thing to note is that the stability never reaches unity. So there's never a point in the life course where personality traits are so stable that they don't change. The other thing to note, this you're looking at, I'll actually get to that because that's an explicit part. These are on average 7 years. So for each stage, yeah. It's a little less than that down in these studies of kids because they tend not to follow them as long. Well, no, what it is these are 0 to 3-year-olds studied for 7 years. So that's how to think about it. Does that make sense? Okay, question?
Yeah, similar. So it was 3-year-olds then asked at 10, or they were asked at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8?
Varied. So these are basically taking the averages of all those waves as you go. And I'll show you when you decompose it, I'll show you the curves. So this is just the average picture you get on the typical longitudinal studies. So this is like on average of 7 years, this is the thing you see. It does definitely get affected by time, and I'll show you that. That's part of the story. Some of my colleagues argued that personality was fixed like plaster. I think we already heard that. At 30, that's clearly not the case. If it's fixed at all, it's fixed in the 50s, but not earlier than that. The stabilities that we found in childhood were actually higher than we expected, given the arguments that developmental scientists had made. So we were a bit surprised by that. The other thing you should note is that there's no conspicuous stage of the life where things differ. If you study squids, you will find that there's no continuity between the pre-adolescent phase and the adult phase of squids when it comes to their personality. Yes, there is a study of squid personality that crosses developmental space. And when you look at the test-retest correlation from an adolescent squid to an adult squid, it's 0. So their storm and stress during adolescence is much more severe than ours. But if you think about the situationist argument that changes in life course conditions are the most important factor for determining stability and change, that happens right here, and there's really nothing conspicuous in that period. Okay? Yeah.
So how do you differentiate this from just being measurement error? Maybe it is completely constant and you're just measuring with different noise every time.
We did that too. It adds a constant of about 0.10. So I don't like doing it to the estimates. So you just bump them up about, so from 0.3 to 0.4, 0.4 to 0.5. So there are some issues with which type of reliability you want to use in that situation. The one that you want to use is the short-term test-retest, which is unavailable for the majority of the measures that are produced. It's not typically conspicuously different than the others, and I didn't find any relationship between reliability and age, so it's just a constant. So, okay. So how important is this set of findings? This was published in 2000. 2010, a colleague did the same thing with everything that had been published since then. So 2018, we should find a third one in about a year or two because we love our test-retest stability. So he found the exact same findings with a new set of studies, about 70 or 80 of them. So to your question, how stable are things over the long term? If you can do this a number of different ways, so you can start at different ages. I'm just going to show you one. So hypothetically starting with an 18-year-old, what does it look like as you stretch things out over time? This is the function that we derived from a paper which was our closest attempt to be kind of like an econometrics person. let's say, set up a model beforehand and make predictions about what it should look like, and then ask whether that accounted for what was going on. So this is with Chris Fraley. It was a really nice paper where we said, okay, if you're going to account for the stability of personality, you should have something like genetics that doesn't change. You should have transactional processes that contribute to development over time. And you should have just random error. We found in the end that all you needed was a fixed effect of like a gene and random error, and you could account for the patterns we saw. What you get is a relatively fast drop-off over time, and then a plateau. And we've argued that the plateau is significant because it is different than other measures of socio-emotional skills. So if you look at a life satisfaction measure or well-being measure, this comes down to 0. And so things that aren't necessarily trait-like have a quality of not having long-term stability. So as you go out farther, the stability gets lower, and as you get out, it really gets to be around 0.3. And so these were longitudinal studies that at best went out 30 years or so. Those are the longest long-term studies at that point. Yeah, I said that. This part of the line is a bit of an extrapolation, right? It's a prediction that if we actually had studies like that, they would go out that far. In the subsequent years, there were a couple of studies that were published, just one recently out of the Deary group in Scotland that caused us some consternation. So Hampson, Goldberg, and company published a long-term study out of the Hawaiian longitudinal study that at least for neuroticism had a 0 estimate for a 40-year test-retest stability. And he was rather upset about that and said that that's a problem for these models and for the idea of personality continuity. The Harris et al. Paper examined a relatively impoverished measure, but did so over a longer period of time than it has ever been done in history. I think it was 60 years. And they found 0 correlation between teacher ratings done when they were kids at 11, I believe, and then self-reports and observer reports later when they were 70. And so this could be, let's say, used to argue that things aren't stable. The Project Talent sample, which I told you about, was followed up, at least part of it. I think I told you those things. Okay. In 2013, when the group was approaching its 50th high school reunion, the folks at the American Institute of Research brought it to a bunch of economists and psychologists and said, somebody please do something with this. And the people at HRS did a pilot study to try to figure out whether they could be tracked at all. And so they grabbed a random sample of, I believe, 4,000 or 5,000 to see how many people would respond. And they got about 1,700 folks to respond to the request to do another survey. And in the follow-up survey, we re-administered the personality inventory that had been given back in high school. And so this gives you essentially a 50-year longitudinal study that has the same method across both time periods. So it's kind of, it's a deal at least from that. It's still self-report, which is not great, but nonetheless, not bad. And here are the stabilities we found across the 10 Project Talent personality inventories. And what you see is basically on average about a 0.3 correlation across all of these. The orange bars are the ones disattenuated for unreliability of the short-term test-retest. And it didn't differ much by measure. The impulsiveness measure acts differently on that scale. But the mature personality, which is a conscientiousness measure, did fine. So did culture, which is openness. Tidiness, which is a cleanliness facet of conscientiousness. Yes?
To personalities trend is a function of age.
Excuse me?
To personalities trend is a function of age, so is that like a...
I'm going to get there. So back to our prognostication. We were kind of pleased because it got us back to the line that we had predicted. So at least one data point that's consistent with it. But it's very rare to have these long-term data points at all. So tracking people for a lifetime takes, of course, a lifetime. And it's very seldom the case that a researcher has that opportunity. What about mean level change in personality? We did a meta-analysis in 2006. This is an extrapolation. The 3 middle parts of the big 5 change the most systematically and in the same direction. So people increase, at least by psychological standards, dramatically on agreeableness, emotional stability, and conscientiousness. The amount of change you see in any given decade is modest, about a quarter of a standard deviation, so 20 to 30, 30 to 40. Across the entire life course, if you make an assumption that the changes that happen in each decade can be stacked together. It looks dramatic, but I have to admit that this is, again, a kind of this is cheating with data, right? This isn't really what we found because each of these sections is really a separate meta-analysis. We kind of said, hey, what does that look like? And at the time we said, if you make the assumption that things are cumulative, it looks like for these traits you get about a standard deviation of change, which it sounds like for you guys that would be a big effect size. For psychologists it's a big effect size. And so we were like, oh, okay, that's pretty remarkable and dramatic. So not only do you change a lot, and for the most part you change in a relatively positive fashion if you assume that being a nice person and being organized and not being anxious are good things. Yeah.
Are you comparing like the same instrument every time?
Yeah. So this is longitudinal studies that measure the same trait with the same instrument, the same people over time. So it ended up being a subset of the prior longitudinal data set, about 90 studies. And we partitioned that into different age periods the same way and found this type of mean level change. Extroversion shows a more complex pattern. So your propensity to be talkative and the fun person at the dinner tonight, that seems to be flat. So it doesn't go up or down with the life course. Your willingness to be assertive and take the lead of other people in social settings, that seems to increase, especially in young adulthood. So. No. There's no gender story so far that we've found. So there's no difference between men and women on stability. There's no difference across the big five on stability. When it comes to mean level change, obviously there's a difference across the different traits. But men and women change the same way across the life course, with the important caveat that women start out better and stay better. And I use that term, I think, accurately. That on most good traits, women score higher, with the exception of certain facets of neuroticism, right? So women will be higher on some of the anxiety facets of neuroticism, but they'll be lower on aggression. They'll be higher on conscientiousness. They'll be higher on agreeableness. They'll be the same on extroversion and assertiveness. They'll be same on openness and creativity. So, and those differences, which start in adolescence, just stay consistently. So guys, you're just not catching up. So. Got to have goals. This gives you an idea. I just stacked the amount of change during each period of the life course. And this is, I've been telling this for a long time. So the majority of personality trait change in the life course happens not in adolescence, but it happens in adulthood. It happens in the transition from adolescence into adulthood. So the key period of the life course for a socio-emotional skill development is actually when you're 20, 25, 30. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you were saying that across countries we can't really compare these measures.
Right, yeah.
But do you think they're comparable across gender?
Yeah, most of the work, to the best of the ability of the measurement nerds that I know who do hardcore measurement equivalent stuff using IRT models, the gender differences are not pronounced. Within cultures, you get comparable ratings across ages. Across cultures, no. But this data set is almost exclusively the US plus some Western cultures, New Zealand, English-speaking European countries, right? There's, I think, no data in this data set from Asia entirely, which is a problem. If you look at the cross-sectional aging studies, the age trends tend to be universal. There are differences, depending upon the culture, in the speed with which you change. But it looks like most everybody does this across different places, even given the lack of comparability. Yeah.
Do you see any differences in terms of like the education path or socioeconomic status for different individuals?
In relationship to this?
Yes, so the change in traits, is that different across different socioeconomic status?
I'll do something related, but in a little bit. It's a great question.
Is this change for young adults, do you attribute to the big changes happening in their lives or to their brains that for some reason?
Are those different?
You tell me.
I like to say I'm a phenotypist. I'm not a biological person. I like to study phenotypes, not genotypes. But at least my friends who argue for the brain pruning stage of life. Say it's at 0 to, or it's from 10 to 18. I don't have it here, but I could show you this. There's a rather embarrassing trajectory for social-emotional skills in adolescence. So almost everything good goes down from age 10. And I mean everything, not just the big five, but self-efficacy, locus of control, motivational measures. Teenagers don't say yes to a lot of our measures. You can question the validity of it, but it's been a real problem for organizations like ACT and ETS, who desperately wanted to move into the non-cognitive space and start producing tests that could be used. And you know, their model is you assess math skill, and then you say, okay, you score at about the 8th grade, and you're in 6th. That's great. You're like an 8th grader. Well, if you did that with non-cognitive measures, you reach your halcyon age at 10, and then so you don't want to be like a 12-year-old, right? So this has been a real problem in terms of making those kind of age-graded cumulative arguments. That might be a measurement quality. Again, back to, is it a skill or is it a trait? If you measure it like an absolute thing, it seems to really indicate a drop, which is not good. So there's lots of stories that are told about development in adolescence and childhood. The phenotypes that we look at don't conform well to those. And then when it comes to the changes, you just see a real dramatic accumulation of positive things that happen in young adulthood. I'll give you one argument why. Okay, so we looked at the mean level change in the Project Talent data. So this is the longest long-term mean level change study. One argument is that this is inaccurate. It's a bit too generous, right? So I have some friends, Chris Fraley being one of them, who is one of my co-authors, that will argue for a hard set point model of human functioning. It's one of the arguments about personality traits, right? They should drag you back to where you really are, right? There's this deep core that keeps you who you are. You might deviate from it temporarily because of the girlfriend or job or the country you move to, but then when you get back home, you go back to being you, right? That's the set point argument, and that would mitigate against this cumulative idea that really you should see a plateauing and a dropping off. If you bother to follow people for longer times, you should see less change. And what we found in the Project Talent data was actually the opposite. So that's actually the metrics up to 2 standard deviations now. And so mature personality here is the conscientiousness measure. It was over 1.5 standard deviations higher at age 68 than it was at age 16. And so you see this really nice cumulative picture. Calmness, which was a good indicator of emotional stability, was a bit more than a standard deviation. Self-confidence, which is one of the assertiveness facets and emotional stability, was a full standard deviation. Social sensitivity, which is closest to agreeableness, a full standard deviation. Tidiness, which was related to conscientiousness, also a full standard deviation. So I was very pleased by this because we've been lying with data for a long time saying maybe this is the way it works. But this study really does confirm that the cumulative increase tends to keep on going. And so not only do you get better in young adulthood, but you still continue in smaller increments in middle age and even old age continue to change, which is interesting. The other thing I didn't tell you is that we still find changes in personality traits in middle age and old age. So there's no magical age where you snap shut and stop changing. Now, it's true that you decrease in the probability of changing. That could be attributable to a lot of things. We haven't tested why yet, but the capacity for change still seems to be there. Yeah.
I wondered, you said that this holds for different countries and cultures, and I wondered whether part of the changes that you see are also that people conform to certain ideas that culture has about people in different
right.
at different points in their life. Like people go into middle age and they have children and for example, mothers are expected to be more tidy than when they were in college, for example. And I wonder whether that is something you pick up.
They are? I know I forgot something. No, you're making me regret that I actually took out Wiebke's study. So Wiebke, Blythorn has a really nice study along with Jaap Dennison in which they examined cross-country data on the Big Five. It's aging, it's not longitudinal. But they looked at the acquisition and timing of adult social roles. In certain countries like Pakistan, you make the transition much earlier than a country like Denmark or Norway. And they looked at the mean levels of the big five, and they found that those countries where you accelerate the life course, at least by our standards, and acquire the adult roles earlier, show an accelerated pattern of change. So they're getting emotionally stable faster, conscientiousness faster. And the places where we delay, where we can say, yeah, you can be a kid until you're 30, those folks aren't showing as much change. So it's a really nice study. I took it out, sorry. But there does seem to be some evidence for that. Okay, so I think I've already made this point. So that 50-year finding shows that the personality trait change is cumulative, which is interesting and nice. I think it shows that this, even a moderate set point model or idea for human nature is wrong, right? It doesn't seem that people are being dragged down to some baseline that they demonstrated when they're 16. They're growing and they're continuing to grow, which is interesting. It of course invites a question of why, which you've asked. Let me give you a couple of answers to that. So our biggest answer to that is what we call the social investment principle, which is the idea manifest in Vipke's study, which is that the anticipation of and acquisition of adult roles is the primary mechanism. And it is the fact that in every culture we know of, if you can provide me an example that's counter to this, I would be grateful. But every culture that we know of, everybody progresses from family of origin to family of destination. And that process entails leaving the family of origin, acquiring some kind of training and or position in a career or a job. You have to manage and or try to figure out what you're going to do in terms of mating. Are you going to get married? Are you going to have a long-term relationship? Are you going to have kids? So you need to find a social position, find a career, find a relationship, figure out what you're going to do in terms of creating a new family and how you're going to do it. And there's just not any cultures we know of where that's just not the norm at some level. There might be, if you can find one, I'd be really grateful because it's anthropologically interesting if we can, because then we might be able to study them. But it's that process, and it's not just the acts of doing these things, it's often the anticipation, right? That you can start planning. It's like, if I'm going to be a parent, what do I need to do? How do I need to behave? If I'm going to be a professor, do I need the tweed jacket with the patch, and should I get that now? And get that later. So these are you can anticipate. We have some studies where we've shown that just the anticipation of adult roles is related to change in the big five. So, but we think it's a combination of those things. We've done the expectation studies where we ask people, how should people be at different ages? And at least in the US, it's really clear how we should be, and it conforms perfectly to the age trends that you see. Here's one from Germany. I always like this one. So how many of you took the Abitur? Not many of you are from, and I'm assuming you did well. I rode past one of the gymnasiums in Tübingen the other day, and they were all dancing outside, singing about the Abitur. I figured they were just finished because they were happy. It seemed like a good thing. So Vipke, again, did a really nice study where she took the 12th graders and the 13th graders in the German educational system, a subsample, and tracked their personality change during those years. 12th graders, of course, are not taking the Abitur. They're just hanging out. And the 13th graders are preparing until they're taking it is it right about now that you would take it? Earlier, a little earlier? Okay, maybe they got their test scores back. I don't know. And so it's as close to an experiment as we could do. And so you see that the 12th graders don't increase much in terms of conscientiousness, but the 13th graders in Germany accelerate almost, I think, 3/4 of a standard deviation and get up there. She didn't have the money to follow them up. It would be a really cool study to do, right? Because you have a natural experiment for who's taking this. You also had the experiment where you changed back and forth from 12th to 13th grade, which would have been really cool.
But I don't understand. I mean, isn't some of the questions in the conscientiousness questionnaire?
Am I hardworking? Yeah. So in terms of the proof of concept, I'm satisfied, right? But you're totally right, and I'll get to that in the last study that I showed. So you could say that this change is just what we would think of as state change, right? Right now, I'm working hard. I look back at myself, and I must be more conscientious. So that's where you really want the long-term follow-up to see if it sticks. And she didn't have it here. But it's at least some evidence that this kind of normative investment in things that you're supposed to do in your community is related to the changes that we see.
So T1, T2, and T3, what points in time to those?
It was over a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like an academic year?
Yeah. So beginning of the school year to the end of the school year, which your German one's much longer than ours, so I always forget that. So you have like 11 months as opposed to what we do. Yeah.
Maybe they had some uncertainty about their own time. Maybe they learned about their own type and just update it.
Yeah. It could. I mean, there's lots of self-perception issues here, right? It could be post hoc, rationalization. It's like, ooh, I've been working really hard. I must be conscientious, right? So there's lots of different reasons why somebody might say it. That would be entirely self-presentation. But if they didn't change, then I couldn't even claim there was any relationship.
Do you also have data on like the intermediate track and basic track compared to those who are in the gymnasium? No, they are not existing.
Yeah, so they're not taking the abitur. We do have studies where we've examined the acquisition of adult roles. So in fact, we just had a paper accepted where we did a propensity score matching between a group of students who entered the labor market earlier than other gymnasium students. And the students who entered earlier when matched showed an increase in conscientiousness. So it's as close to causal as we'll get until we run a good experiment. But it was all we could do with that kind of data. So, more questions? No? Okay. So this is our best correlational test of this. So we created a composite of what we call work social investment. So this is normative commitment to your career and your job. And these are common measures in the industrial psychology world. We adopted those for our measure of social investment in work. And what you see there is people in a large sample of adults who increased in their investment in work also increased in their conscientiousness. It's a correlational design, but nonetheless, again, at least some evidence over a 3-year period that you get the association you want. This was actually a replication of a prior longitudinal study, so this appears to be robust, at least the correlation does. So I'm not going to give you much satisfying evidence in terms of causality for the next few minutes, if you don't mind, because we literally don't have the studies, and we don't think like you guys do. So this is where I think the collaboration could be really beneficial. So in the GSUP, in these large panel studies, where you can do these types of instruments that would be really interesting for teasing apart the changes. Psychologists don't think in those terms, and they could learn how to do that. We've adopted your propensity score techniques, which apparently you guys don't use anymore, right? We were there, right? We thought we had causality, and then no, we can't do that. So yeah. But the psychologists don't know that yet. I'm in this horrible position where I'm editing all these papers, and these people are like, "Here's a propensity score design. I can infer causalities," but no, you can't. Not even the economists think that anymore. So, what can you do? But I'm going to show you a bunch of correlational studies. Other experiences that are correlated with change in personality, marital stability and conscientiousness has been shown across a number of studies. So if you just stay married or in a marriage-like relationship for a longer period of time, you grow more conscientious. So it doesn't have to do with the quality of it or the experience, just sticking it out. That was across 2 longitudinal studies. If you have a good job and a good marriage, it's really nicely related to decreases in neuroticism or increases in emotional stability. So I wish upon you a happy job and a good marriage, because at least in terms of neuroticism, which again is one of the strongest predictors of psychopathology, it would be a protective factor, right? Which would be very important. Doing or not doing drugs, this has been shown across a number of different populations now. So if you continue to do drugs in a non-normative fashion, especially into your adult period, 30s, 40s, it's not that you decrease in conscientiousness, you just don't increase like other people. In the United States, we call this arrested development. And so it's true for alcohol and drugs. And some of the best research on this is coming out of the clinical domain. Ken Schur and his student Littlefield have done some really nice longitudinal studies showing that continued abuse of drugs is related to an attenuated development of personality. We did the same thing with counterproductive or criminal activities at work. So people go to work and get in fights, steal things, undermine the boss. It's something you guys would never think of, but in other occupations it's not unusual. Those folks don't show the normative increases in conscientiousness and emotional stability. And then changes in physical and mental health. So if things go poorly for you, I have had a broken hip and surgery, a broken foot and a boot, skin cancer and arthritis for the last year. Not feeling very conscientious. So if those kind of years happen to you, it just takes the top off of things, right? And again, it could be totally like just you're not endorsing goodness as much, and that's the effect. But the correlation is there. And again, it could be really important, right? If this is propagating forward and you don't recover, it could have profound effects on other outcomes that these dispositions, let's say, account for. What does not? Okay, so this is where we might have a strong difference of opinion. So this is where we get into the effect size discrepancy between the fields. What, from my perspective, and maybe Julia's, do not contribute to personality development. Socioeconomic background, by our standards, is an unimportant predictor of personality. Okay, we just did a meta-analysis where we took parental SES and as many studies as we could find. I think 500,000, 300,000 people in the meta-analysis, and then we had a sample of 2 million people, thanks to a colleague, where we linked parent SES to kids' personality. And the average correlation is about 0.05, except for openness, where it's 0.15, with the assumption being that that correlation is really a reflection of intelligence, because sometimes saying you're smart is related to whether you are. And so we didn't take that very seriously. But across the other big five, by our standards, a 0.05 is not much. I just talked to an economist in Tübingen who said that the differential effect results in some remarkable return on investment if you could solve it, like 5%. So I'm ready to be told that our conclusions were wrong, that it is still potentially an important policy-relevant effect size. From a psychological effect size, the arguments that we deal with, like if I'm talking to a sociological or an educational group, they're going to tell me, oh, it's just all socioeconomic background. You know, that's why you have the personality you do. It's just a Western right-wing white embodiment of thinking, right? And yes, this is a response I've seen and received, right? No, that's not right. At least from that perspective, they're arguing that it's synonymous. Synonymous is like a correlation of 0.5.
So is this on your level of personality traits at some age, or is it the development of personality across ages?
Just the level at certain ages is all we could do at this point. So, and we partitioned it across different periods of the life course, childhood, adolescence, and there was no difference. So.
Would be interesting to see the graphs you showed before by socioeconomic studies.
Yeah, it's not very big. So at least, again, but this is my perspective as a psychologist. So, and I'm more than willing to entertain the possibility that it's not informed by policy level interpretations, right? Psychologists don't think policy. We don't think population size. We don't think if this is going to happen to the whole population is important. That's actually a mistake, right? Because I think there's an interesting idea in epidemiology called population at risk, right? Well, we all have a personality. So it's a big population that's at risk. So, but we tend not to extrapolate or generalize into those fields. Parents' personality, I stand to be corrected here too, but you had some studies where you're looking at transmission across generations. The correlation between parents' personality and their biological offspring's personality, regardless of age, is on average 0.13. This is a meta-analysis of 90 studies, both adoption studies and twin studies and epidemiological studies.
But at least by the data that you described before, that would mean that you don't really have, for example, the parents when they were young. And do you have data where you actually measure them at the same time if it's actually developing over time?
Yeah, there's two studies so far, and they don't show any difference. I think I just had a person tell me that they found a difference in a different study, but we literally don't have the panel studies where you measure the parents at 20 and then wait for them to have kids and then measure their kids at 20. We have, I think, 2 longitudinal twin studies where that happened. And in those studies, the relationship between the parent's personality and the kid's personality did not change markedly, which I was surprised by.
Could it also be because maybe when the parents were young, there were different patterns, if it's about having children?
I totally agree. I mean, I would totally, given the age trends, right? If everybody's growing more mature, right, then you would expect there would be a convergence. On the covariance space, it just doesn't seem to have much of an effect. So by our standards, this is a low correlation. It's also a low correlation in the sense of, like, is there transmission at a notable developmental consequential level, right? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree type metaphors that we use all the time, right? That's, you know, if it's a 0.15 correlation, yeah, it follows and rolls and goes a long way sometimes. It's almost random, right? You're just as likely to have an introvert if you're an extrovert as an extrovert. And across a couple of kids, you're not going to get the same kid.
But similar, I mean, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. They only say that when you become 50. They don't say that to 15-year-olds. They say, and so like we know that these trends are trending over time, over their lifetime. They become more like everyone turns into their parents when they're 50. They're not they were their parents when they're 20. But.
Now, I'm not making the argument you don't become your parents, because I have become my parent. And I think there's, again, back to the first presentation in terms of assessment, I think there are qualities that we share with our parents that are socializable, style issues, right, that are not genetic, that you can acquire, but they're not getting captured on something like the Big Five. That would be my inference. So, and there's lots of other qualities that you do share at a higher level, IQ, values, though not demonstrably stronger, but more like a 0.2, 0.25 correlation. So, but this is just saying, sticking to the Big Five, the correlation is relatively small. I'm going to go over here in the corner and hide. Birth order is functionally unrelated to personality traits. Why do I say that? Because if you go to birth order theory in psychology, it's used to interpret the differences between siblings in one family, right? Older kids are dominant, conscientious, assertive, responsible. Younger kids are rebellious, right? They're out there questioning everything. I'm sorry if you're a middle child, you're just kind of screwed, right? And if you look at Frank Soloway's work, he paints a very compelling argument that this is a dramatic effect, and his estimates of the effects are in the neighborhood of a 0.3 correlation. This is based on lots of data points that you help provide in studies like the SUP and others that provide tens of thousands of data points. And the correlation there is about 0.03, which is still statistically significant in a large sample, but from a psychological developmental perspective, not consequential. Again, not policy, but maybe something else.
Have you considered nonlinear relations?
We did everything under the sun. Julia is a better expert on this, but nonlinear.
Nonlinear
You mean like not linear with birth order?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did that. We separated it like the positions. Like we don't assume that it's like, we do that. It's not.
Just to make things clear, Julia's done like the best study ever done on birth order and personality. So if you're interested, she's here. So, going to college or not, you'll find no published data on this because there's no effect. So what you do in college, yes, that's related to how you develop. But whether you go or not, at least so far, it has no reliable signal. And the most embarrassing of all, those of your parents might dispute, having kids or not, if it's related to anything, it's related to a mild increase in neuroticism, which if you're a parent, you can appreciate. But the signal there is really, really small, which is disconfirming of my social investment idea, and really interesting. So we don't quite know what's going on there. But this is pretty systematic, that we don't find a strong relationship. Okay. Can personality traits be changed? It appears so. So we did another meta-analysis because the granting agencies refused to give me any money.
Just a question before you move ahead. Are there no studies looking at spousal effects and partner effects?
Yeah, for the most part, they're innocuous. So you don't converge to be like your partner. That was a very popular idea back in the 90s. So birds of a feather. Well, actually, we don't sort on personality very well. We sort on SES and IQ because we often marry the people we meet in college or in our first jobs, right? And so there's a tremendous amount of sorting there. But with the Big Five, it's almost random. There are some newer studies that are arguing there are different framing effects and ways of going at it that might show stronger effects. But most of the studies that attempted to show that didn't. And then the studies that looked longitudinally and asked, do you get more like your spouse? They didn't find much effect. Not, I'm talking Big Five, not. I assume they have.
When we looked at it, everything was assigned, essentially.
There is some.
Even the religious background of my parents.
Well.
I mean, it's amazing, even as of today, how much, education, everything is highly, highly positive. So is trust and so is risk-taking.
But you're.
And also, the longer they stay together, the more similar, or you could also say the more similar, the more likely they stay together. But one could use the 15-item supervision of the 5 to level check?
Yeah.
Is that
There is something super weird about the personality measures and like partner effects in the GSOP. So actually the correlations were way too high. So they actually did that in the innovation center. They tried to figure.
in the big 5, you mean?
Yeah. So there were like some weird things going on there where people suspected that it's because they're being interviewed verbally.
No.
They,
No, I know the details.
Did you write this down someplace? Because
I've given talks, I don't know, I'm often giving this talk on intergenerational reply and soil training. These interviews are taken one-on-one. That's very important. And much of the correlation is coming not from the soil mating methods, but from the intergenerational. From kids and parents that have been separated, living at different places for decades.
what I wanted to say is like they tried to test that and did actually like randomize and like record who's in the room and so on, and so they couldn't like pin down why the GSOP has this super high correlation in comparison to other panel studies. So there seems to be something, and I don't think anybody ever figured it out.
High quality measures.
well, there's also a weird phenomenon going in the SUP with the second wave and the personality measures. So there's a plummet across time in all the measures of the Big Five.
The risk measure is great.
But the question, but Armand, the question I always have to ask you is how highly correlated are your econ measures with IQ? If you're just doing proxies of IQ, if they correlate 0.4 with IQ, then yeah, we assort on IQ, and that's fine. But
this is conditional on IQ.
It's conditional on IQ. Oh, okay, I want to see that data. Okay. I know. Damn. There's email. Send me those. So as I was alluding to, giving presentations with data like this, the natural question is, okay, personality stable and changeable. Seem to be sensible correlates of personality change. You've convinced me that personality changes and develops. Can you change it? And for the longest time, we wanted to answer that question, but didn't have the opportunity to. As I alluded to, the funding agencies refused to give me money to test it because the idea of intervening on personality traits was anathema to them. And so we turned to our favorite practice, which is to do meta-analyses. This kind of emerged out of a realization that there were some clinical studies that some of my colleagues who were clinicians had bothered to measure personality traits in conjunction with their typical outcomes. So a typical outcome in a clinical study would be depression, anxiety, agoraphobia, one of the concrete psychopathologies in a symptom list of some sort. But clinicians tend to be very good on the measurement side and very thorough. So they would often throw in the Spielberger state trait measure of anxiety, or state trait measure of aggression, or inventory they call the inventory of interpersonal behavior, which seems innocuous, but what it is pathological extroversion and disagreeableness. So it's a trait measure, but pinned towards clinical work. And so we started down this path, and then it took us about 6 years because we discovered that there's lots of data, but it was in small little pockets of the database that couldn't be searched. So we had to do it literally by hand to try to find the studies. Questions we asked in the study were which traits change the most. The expectation in this case would be neuroticism, just simply because that's the thing people are going into a clinician for. But we were open to seeing whether other Big Five measures changed. Does therapy cause personality trait change? Sorry, I have some experimental data. So there's a subset of studies that were true experiments with control groups that compared the intervention group and control group on personality trait change over time with randomization. Which therapy changes personality most? So in the therapy world, there is the dodo bird effect, which is that no therapy is better than any other in terms of changes for psychotherapy outcomes, which is a huge conundrum for the clinical psychologist.
I'm sure you will get to it in a minute, but did you randomly assign therapies?
No, they never do that.
But then isn't that so highly endogenous?
Yeah. And there's a wonderful analysis by a separate team that showed that the best predictor of whether a therapy works or not is the allegiance of the researcher. So if you're a cognitive behavioral person, you publish the data showing that CBT works better. If you're the psychoanalytic person, you're the one who publishes the one that psychoanalyzes. So yeah, I'm not going to argue that these are great. Most of these studies, to be honest with you, the experimental studies, are from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And they would typically compare CBT versus, let's say, relational therapy versus some kind of control, which you could argue is modestly randomization of treatment, but not entirely. But the clinicians do a really nice job in these studies. They manualize them, they structure them. They don't do stimulus sampling, but it's kind of beyond their ken. So.
Then it's not clear to me what we can actually learn or like measure from these.
I'm trying to do something causal. Work with me for a little bit. Just kidding. It's as close as I've gotten so far. Which patients change the most? So there's presenting problems, right? People come to a therapist for a variety of reasons. Most common are anxiety and depression, but eating disorders, alcohol use disorders. And then how fast does change happen? So does it happen quickly? Does it happen slowly? How long does it last? Okay, so down the meta-analytic rabbit hole, I don't recommend this technique. You guys don't do meta-analysis, do you? Good. Keep it that way. Labor and economics? Okay. So we have the obvious candidates. I've already alluded to the fact that there are these other measures. These are the ones that caused us a conniption because we couldn't find them at first. And when you did find them, you would then have to dig through the data to get different things. It took a long time. 207 studies with about 20,000 people was the net result of these efforts. We probably went through about 700 studies in total. Many of them don't report the right data or statistics, so that was tough. But we did come up with a decent number. The average intervention was about 24 weeks, the median being 18. So this is probably tied more to reimbursement regimens in the United States than the intent of the therapist. It's also dragged a little bit longer than normal because we did have a fair number of psychoanalytic studies, which tend to go for a year or more because the psychoanalysis folks don't believe you can really change anything, for at least not anything meaningful quickly. So. Multiple types of interventions. So we did have psychopharm, CBT, supportive therapy, psychoanalysis. Disorders, depression, anxiety, eating, personality disorders. So we even have change in personality disorders, which is a fascinating thing. So the clinicians used to distinguish, they still kind of do, between the axis 1 or the presenting problems that are assumed to be state-like, that's anxiety and depression, and those that are trait-like, which are the personality disorders. Antisocial personality disorder, or like the favorite one in the United States currently, narcissistic personality disorder. Can't imagine why, but we're obsessed with that. What do we find? So here's the meta-analytic estimate across all 207 studies of the pre-post change in personality traits. And we found something pretty consistent with what we expected and a bit remarkable. I was expecting a D of about 0.25. We found a D above 0.5. So you get over half a standard deviation in change in emotional stability as a result of seeing a therapist. Contextualized in terms of the life course, remember we had about a standard deviation of change across a 40 to 60 year period. This would imply that by seeing a therapist you could get a half of a life of change in neuroticism. So it's a big effect size by our standards and by others too. Yeah.
So is this self-reported?
This is all self-reported.
Okay, so it's
absolutely.
Not to kind of demand effect that they...
It could be entirely demand effects, right? It's not, but I'll show you. I'll show you. Let's say the data that shows that. Mid-study, I had a crisis and said this is just demand effects. But there are ways of looking at it that might allay some of those fears. But there are really no systematic observational ratings, not even from clinicians. So there's some good studies waiting to be done.
So when did you measure post-change? Like often these effects tend to fade out fairly quickly.
I'll get there. Great question. So you do, of course, see change in the other big five, but not quite as much as you might expect. They weren't the focus of most of the therapeutic interventions. Most therapeutic interventions are designed to get people back on their feet and get them back, in normal functioning. They're not necessarily designed, at least in the minds of the therapists themselves, to change your personality. In fact, none of them were objectively stated to do that. They're mostly saying, let's resolve symptoms, basically. But it is also the case that they helped change personality traits. My now questioned experiments. So there's lots of reasons not to like these experiments, both from the stimulus sampling perspective. They're also almost exclusively weightless control designs because that's the only thing they could do back then ethically. They can't do that now ethically. So there are no longer true control groups in any of this type of research. You can only compare one therapy against another. And there we find zero effects. But in the true experimental designs where there is randomization of treatment, you see the same basic pattern, that there is an improvement in emotional stability. Back to your question. So does personality stick, or personality change stick? which for me was kind of it helped resolve the idea that this was just demand characteristics. So a subset of about 57 studies bothered to track people past the termination of therapy. So some of them as far as 16 years, but most of them in about a year or more after that. So in my mind, this is the best comeback to the idea that it's just demand characteristics, because a year later, you shouldn't necessarily be saying, oh, my therapist wanted me to get better. Let me tell my therapist that I stayed better, right? But it's still possible. But this is at the termination of therapy. This is 0 to 6 months. That's 6 months to a year. That's 1 year or more. So at least for these studies, which are not experimental studies, mind you, I don't know if you're familiar with the study out of Irvine that showed the decline effect after cognitive interventions for kids. So there's a fade-out effect for all the cognitive intervention studies that people like to trumpet, abecedarian and those things that say you can improve cognitive functioning in children. If you bother to follow up all those studies, it fades to 0 after a few months, I believe. That doesn't seem to be happening here, but these aren't true experiments, so I'm not quite sure what to make. But at least at one brush of the data, the changes that are imparted in therapy tend to stick for this sample. Type of therapy didn't really matter, just like it doesn't really matter for therapeutic outcomes. So there's no evidence that personality disorders, or psychodynamic, I should say, things work less well than CBT. My clinical friends hate this because they're all CBTers now, and they say that can't be true, but it does seem to be true. Here's the type of patient, and I like this. Personality disorders change just as much as other types of disorders. The group that changed the most were the ones with anxiety disorders. The group that changed the least were the substance use people, which is distressing to some degree because of the opioid epidemics and the like that we have. And then how fast did personality change? Remarkably fast. So you get the majority of change happening within the first few weeks of the therapeutic intervention, 6 to 8 weeks. Yeah.
So how intensive are these treatments normally? Is it like every day that they meet, or?
It depends. It varied. So some of them were in a hospital. Those were the worst, by the way. Some of them were group-based. Some of them were treatment at a facility. Some of them were weekly. So we didn't do that kind of intensity. We did check the dosage in this case. And there seems to be an asymptote that after a few weeks, it doesn't seem to have more of an effect. So, yes?
So did I see that right? One treatment was just like pharmacological, so
Mm-hmm.
actually antidepressants.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay, would change your personality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So just
In
as
a positive way.
it reduces your neuroticism. And 25% of the US population are now taking them. And it's supposedly in our water system too, so it's one big interesting intervention. So this for me was the most surprising finding and also the most troubling from a theoretical perspective, because we had argued, I had argued, that the most likely course of personality trait development was gradual, incremental, and not dramatic. But this really opens up the possibility that personality trait change can happen in a dramatic fashion. Whether you believe this is real change or not is somewhat immaterial. It shows that, the proof, the case can be made that there are people who show quick change, which is interesting because it wasn't part of our conceptualization of the traits. Questions generated by this. Is the change really lasting? Is it real? Does it really happen so quickly? I didn't trust my own meta-analysis. Back to an earlier question, is this just state level change, right? They're responding to their therapy situation. Their therapist is saying, you're looking better. They say, yeah, I'm looking better. They're feeling happier because of the resolution of symptoms. So they're just reporting that they're happier, and that's affecting their neuroticism score, which is a nice confound. So can we tease those apart? And so we needed some research that tracked personality traits a little more systematically over time. Most of these studies did intake, 2 months, 4 months, 1 year type things. But what would happen if you actually assess personality week by week? Would you get a real bead on when that change occurs, right? Is it something that happens at week 4, or is it something that happens in week 1? We didn't know that, so we wanted to understand that. We needed research that actually tracked states simultaneously, which hadn't been done in the prior studies. So we I took advantage of one of my students. I know that's hard to believe. There was a social work student who wanted to do an RCT on mindfulness-based relapse prevention therapy for drug and alcohol abusers. And so he came to me and said, I want to do this. And I said, great, I've got a design for you. Let's randomize them and then administer personality and state measures pretty continuously over a long period of time, and then make sure we do a long-term follow-up. And then we'll be able to tease apart whether there is an effect, when the effect occurs, whether the effect is attributable to states or traits. And he said yes. And he is regretting it now. Yeah.
So do you normally ask exactly the same questions then every week?
Yeah, it's actually, in this case, it was every 2 weeks.
So what do people remember the questions and then just like, okay, last week I said yes to everything and now I will just do the same?
This sample couldn't even keep the same cell phone from week to week. So, it's quite possible, but it was an entirely unique sample. So these were people remanded to drug treatment because of the courts in Champaign, where we live. And they were predominantly needy, predominantly coming off of heroin or methamphetamine addiction. So they were not in good shape. They weren't your typical undergraduates. Which was good because they were actually better participants. They were invested in it. They wanted to do it, but could they remember? Possibly, but it was a very interesting population. Okay, so here's the randomization. We had a MBRP, which is the mindfulness-based relapse prevention therapy, 8-week sessions in total for the first 4 weeks of treatment. In the treatment as usual group, they got AA meetings to equal the amount of intervention or dose. Assessments, 2 per month, once every 2 weeks, 14 total. Sample size is small, but there's a graduate student doing an RCT. I'm not going to complain. MBRP, if you're not familiar with it, is based off of mindfulness training, which is, of course, a Zen Buddhist philosophy, very popular in the clinical world right now, widely applied to lots of things, including students. I think there was a nice study showing that when applied to students, they got worse. So they got more like themselves. But in this context, they're trying to teach people who have a propensity to be impulsive to monitor their cravings, to distance themselves from the cravings, seek a position of, let's say, serenity in relationship to those things, and then give them these tools that they could use as they go outside of therapy, meditation and relaxation techniques that would help tamp down the cravings and the impulses to take the drugs. Here's the assessment protocol every 2 weeks across 28 weeks. So it went out pretty long so we could see what happened. The treatment was for the first, I believe, 4 weeks. Yeah, that's what it is, and post-treatment. So we followed them for a very long time and got a lot of good data. We measured a bunch of things. Controls are gender, substance use. Substance use was indexed, which was good. We looked at perceived stress as a measure of a state because this is also something that's quite high in this population. And then we used Gerard Saussure's 36 QB6, which is a Hexaco Big Six measure of personality. Here's the effect on the outcome of choice, which was substance use. So the MBRP intervention did work. So at the beginning, this is at the end of treatment, there's still a pretty big effect. The treatment at usual group was more inclined to use. They couldn't use while in treatment because they were actually housed in a treatment center. The few individuals that did use got kicked out, so they're not part of the study. And then as you go through time, the effect is profoundly large. And this is more what you see in clinical intervention research. A 2 standard deviation difference between the amount of drugs they reported using 28 weeks out versus the intervention group, which is the MBRP group. If you look at stress, 2 things to note. It's an incredibly stressed group. So these are really high numbers for this measure. The general population is usually down here. They started out in the 30s and got down to about 25, which is still high stress. So they're not doing great. They're mid-20s folks who are not doing well. They're not holding down jobs regularly. Like I said, a fair number of them didn't have the resources to keep a phone. And so the graduate student assessors would arrange to meet them at pre-designed places at a time. Like 2 weeks from now, I'll meet you at this cafe at 3. And they would show up. But they couldn't keep the phone to be able to make contact. So it's an interesting sample. But as you can see, over time, the MBRP group actually maintained less stress. They're still stressed, but less than the treatment as usual group. And this is the outcome of choice, which is emotional stability. Here is beginning of treatment, and then they come up, both groups come up really nicely. So this is consistent with the idea that the type of treatment doesn't really work or have any difference, right? And then over time, you see a divergence. So the D-scores get bigger over time, such that the MBRP group seems to be maintaining higher levels of emotional stability in relationship to the treatment as usual group.
Yeah, my question was which is orange or
Oh, sorry. So the MBRP is this group here. And so the other thing that, so there's a couple things that I think are important here. One, there is a difference between these two groups. It's interesting. We don't know completely why. One theory is that the MBRP group has a tool, right? They can do meditation and they can do practice. That's something they can take with them and use as they go. The treatment as usual group, if they didn't connect it to AA, which has shown some efficacy in other studies, they didn't have something to continue, and their life got worse. And it showed up in their personality trait changes. This really shows to me that, this to me is like the biggest confound in the meta-analysis. Almost all the change is happening not at week 4, but it's the first week. And this, according to my clinical friends, is not unusual. That a lot of the change happens once you decide to see a therapist, once you have a couple successes.
So to what extent could it be that people expect they're changing and so you adjust your answers but you catch up slow and that's why one side goes down and the other one stays up?
Yeah, it could be. This is where I would want a different modality. I'd like to see observer ratings from friends, peers, loved ones, professionals, anything but self-reports. But it's just uncommon for people to incorporate that into their methods. But it's addressable. Okay, so back to whether it's state or trait, the effects were kind of, they're interesting. So the correlation between changes in stress and changes in neuroticism or emotional stability are very high, 0.64 and 0.73, which you would then say, well, yeah, so the change isn't real, it's just change in your state. Problem with that inference is that the changes in the state were just as robust, which invites the question, if you make somebody less stressed for 6 months, isn't that personality change, right? So we still can't tease this one apart. So they don't go independent of one another, and that might be exactly what you would expect. So we still have questions. Yeah.
I also wonder if it's, so you're trying to relate behavioral change to personality change, right?
Right.
And if it is indeed personality change, can you sort of test it in other realms as well? So not only substance abuse,
right,
but also
other domains. Yeah, that would be spectacular. Yeah. So, but that's the kind of stuff you'd like to see going forward. Other people's, other modalities, other domains. So there's a large literature in the cognitive intervention field that shows there's no far transfer. So if you improve inductive reasoning, you don't improve deductive reasoning. And that's just a truism, right? I hope you're not doing your brain training games. But if you train on brain training games, you get really good at brain training games. And it doesn't affect your cognitive ability. It doesn't affect your long-term memory. If you work on long-term memory, it doesn't affect. So it would be weird, fascinating, interesting if personality worked differently, right? If I change this very specific thing, your stress related to your drug abuse, does it then propagate out into the other contexts?
I mean, I would at least think that personality affects more than just one sort of focus area in your behavior, right?
Yeah. But it's possible that it still works the same way. Yeah. We just don't know. Yeah.
Did you try to stress them and see how they because I'm not thinking emotional stability would be you get stressed, but eyes from the outside, but you don't get stressed on the inside.
Yeah, we'll do the Trier stress test on them next time. No, we didn't. We hope to use this to argue for doing better follow-ups where we do more things. But I've almost ruined my graduate students' life and career by doing this. So it'd be hard to imagine. There is that IRB thing too. I don't think they'd take kindly to taking people recovering from drug and alcohol abuse and stressing them. So might be deemed unethical. Okay. So the short-term change patterns look very similar to the meta-analysis. That was comforting. And the short-term change patterns and traits are indistinguishable from the states. The tau group in this study showed serious fade-out, which was interesting. So I'm I'm always questioning the quality of the data in the meta-analysis because it was really, like we alluded to, reports by people invested in showing that their therapy worked. So I'm skeptical that it's good data and that better data could be acquired. I think I said that. Okay, so summary of our recent findings and personality development in general. The stability of personality as we've seen it is right about where you'd expect it, which is significantly lower, I didn't mention this, than cognitive ability. So cognitive ability is really stable, more in the 50s and to 70s over a long period of time. So if you take Ian Deary's study, for example, seriously, the correlation between age 11 and age 70 is 0.7. Personality traits don't work that way. Social-emotional skills are less stable, 0.2, 0.3 over long, long periods of time. That's where we expected them to be, but it poses an interesting question for their utility. Mean level change appears to be positive and cumulative across the life course. And personality traits can and do change quickly, which is something we hadn't contemplated or incorporated into our theoretical models. So that means they could be the targets of intervention. Okay, implications. So I think we've alluded to this in some of the discussions. In my field, there are like two relatively opposing camps when it comes to understanding personality. The first is the entity folks. Personality traits are temperaments, biological, heritable, unchangeable. So these folks, if they write their papers, will say the big five are accepted taxonomy of personality traits. They are all heritable, and there's evidence that they are tied to biological systems. Therefore, I'm going to use these as predictors of outcomes. And the implication being is that they're causal. That is not an unusual stance for people to take, both to justify the importance of them and to use them in that capacity. That is clearly wrong. They change too much for that conclusion. On the flip side, which we didn't go into, but I alluded to in my discussion about the history of personality, the largest camp is of the opinion that personality traits are ephemeral, change from situation to situation, and don't predict much. I don't have to make that argument to you folks because you look at our small correlations and think that's cool because it's policy relevant. But other fields and other areas within psychology look at a 0.15 correlation and think that's unimportant. And they conclude that personality shouldn't necessarily be invested in. Clearly, there's a middle way, back to our mindfulness position, right? Traits are biological, semi-stable, change, develop, and are changeable, which makes them not much different than any other phenotype that we study in humans, right? So they're not unique in their stability, they're not unique in their changeability, they're very much like everything else that we study. Mundane almost, you might say, but we have yet to keep that clear. So I think in terms of the implications for you, the stability of personality, at least in the windows of 5 to 10 years, is probably high enough to consider them relatively exogenous, right? If you're thinking 40 or 50 years, you're asking an interesting question. There might be a stable component of what's been said at age 10 that will play out. You might want to assume that there's some intervening mechanisms that might account for it. So we should probably pay attention to personality development. The fact that people get significantly better on these as they age is a confound and an opportunity in our studies, right? So if you start studying people at certain ages, they're different than they were before. And if you track them over time, that change itself is an opportunity. So, okay, you guys get that. Okay. So again, I don't think I need to make this argument to you, but change in personality could be itself a mechanism and a predictor for positive outcomes. We don't have much evidence for this in the observational space. The way you do studies, I think you could probably do a better job of determining that than we can. But to date, we don't have designs that allow us to infer causality, where there's change in a personality trait and the change in that trait predicts forward what's happening. So one person who was here was describing an intervention study for grit, and that the intervention changed grit, and that the intervention then subsequently had an impact on grades. That's the kind of study we don't have. By showing that personality traits do change, it invites that type of study to happen. That you can actually say, I'm going to try to change conscientiousness, I'm going to try to change neuroticism, because it's related to these important things, and the change itself might be consequential. In that respect, I think we need a new generation of really nice panel studies that also embed RCTs in them, right? This is where I think the interface between psychology and economics could be quite robust. Because you don't step out the door unless you have a representative sample of rather large magnitude. You also like to do things that are causal. So
We do too, but we don't get the chance. And I think that if you could combine a study like the SUP, where you have run small scale RCTs, right? With personality and with types of interventions that could actually be randomized and done systematically, we could have the type of science that would be, let's say, much more definitive. Right now, I would say the psychological research is provocative, suggestive. We have covariances that would suggest that personality in the form of personality traits and other constructs like interests could be important, and they could be developmental and therefore could be the focus of human capital, right? They can be developed and they could be changed. We don't yet have, I think, the definitive evidence that would support that conclusion. So in some respects, you've got a career's worth of work to do. And now that I'm 68, I'm going to retire. And that's all I've got for you. Thanks. Questions that you haven't asked? Yeah.
Is there any papers you look at then what's the best time to change personality? Because at least what we often look with other abilities, but kind of what's the best time to change it?
Yeah. I really like that question. So Jim Heckman will say that you should change it early and often, right? Because you're going to have consequences for being low on self-control when you're 12. I question that because of that adolescent dip that occurs. So my fear is that you train an 8-year-old to be able to delay gratification, and then they get in with their friends when they're 12, and they're like, yeah, I'm going to delay my gratification right to the bar and get a drink of alcohol because my friends are doing the same thing, right? And they may throw those lessons right out. I don't know. I mean, it might be that it would improve things for them. It's also non-normative for kids to be mature that young. So there's a really provocative study that shows that teenagers who look like adults are actually suffering. So they're ostracized by their friends, right? Some of us might have had that experience. If you were a nerd in high school, right? You weren't cool. You were like, what are you going to do this weekend? Oh, I'm going to read this really cool book. Yeah. And they're like, man, you are not getting invited to the party, right? That actually is related to indices of psychopathology, stress, depression. Right? When they get to be adults, those people do really well because our society rewards them. But you have to ask the kind of normative question, if you're going to try to make all these kids mature at 12 when they're not ready for it or used to it, and it goes against their norms, you might have a very tough road. So I'm of the opinion that we should ask more pointed questions about how and when we intervene. If you look at the meta-analysis of the psychotherapy studies, there was no relationship to age. So age was not a moderator. It wasn't a great assessment of age, so it ranged from teenage through age probably 50. So we did lots of old age samples. Now the cognitive ability literature, where they've done interventions to improve cognitive functioning, show that you can change the cognitive functioning for the better of older individuals. It fades out faster, but you can do so. And we've seen those same types of effects in personality in old age. But I would argue that if you really wanted to do it well, take advantage of the normative increases that happen in the transition, right? If you're going to get conflict management training, make sure you at least do it at the end of high school, entering into college and or your first job. If you're going to teach people, I think it's the McKinsey group. Do you guys know that group? Worldwide consulting firm. Has an amazing program where they do job training for people who are let's say in transition. So they're people who in different countries have had a problem with the law, usually are unemployed and are not very employable. And they go in and they take these people and they say, I can get you a job as a medical technician right now. I just need to train you. And they go, and so you can either go to jail or you can do this. And they go, okay, I'll do that. And then in the process of training them to be a medical technician, they also do personality interventions. Personality interventions along the line of, okay, this is how you show up to work every day in a clean outfit. This is how you organize things. This is how you talk to a supervisor or your peers at work in a way that doesn't cause problems. And they do basic behavioral training that's synonymous with the Big Five. And they have really good outcomes. And so one could argue that getting those young people making the transitions are probably the ideal folks to address. But that's what we know so far. Nope. Okay. Oh, damn it. It's not me.
I guess one more question. I now know that socioeconomic status seems to not influence, at least much, the development of personality traits or personality traits in one moment or at one moment.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, how do you influence the capacity, or how is capacity for changing over time influenced, and then by what factors?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. I only have anecdotes, like the blanking on the school system in New York. That was very popular for taking a bunch of kids and putting them in this kind of character training program early on. I can't remember the name of it. But there's an anecdote tied to that where they at first took all kids, and then they discovered if they were taking kids who were older than 10, it didn't work. And they're predominantly poor. And the argument is that for that population in that setting, by the time you get to your teen years, you probably bought into your peer circumstances in a broader network that is going to be either more appealing or difficult to compete with. But if they got the kids when they were 8, they could, because the demands are pretty severe. It's like they wear uniforms, they behave in a strict fashion, they teach discipline and these things. And they said, just anecdotally, they had to stop taking the older kids. So there might be some situations where you see that type of thing. Admittedly, again, and this is back to Armand, who's not here, talking about why there's not an exchange between psychology and economics, and why we keep on using your data. Because like most of the data that I showed you was from the late 20th century, and they were samples of convenience. They were elite samples of college students. We did not do good sampling. We still don't do good sampling as a guild. You do great sampling. So our opportunity is to even ask those questions. Can you find low-income people from low-income backgrounds, track them over time, and ask the same question? I still think a fair ask of that question hasn't happened. So I will say that SES and personality are independent of each other functionally, but some of the developmental questions seem to be still there to be asked. Could be a bad thing. It's an interesting question, right? So I like telling the anecdote. First time I gave a presentation of the meta-analysis on therapy change was in Trieste, and it was at an international conference, and a gentleman from Poland who spoke no English came up to me and said, "No 1984." Which was a very effective communication of please no authoritarian regimes that will try to make everybody the same. And I'm obviously sympathetic to that argument. I take solace in a couple of facts. We've been trying to change cognitive functioning for the better for a number of centuries. And we still have yet to solve that riddle. So we don't make everybody the same despite the fact that we force them to take the same curriculum. I'm going to guess that personality training, if we ever did it, would be very much the same thing. That yes, you're going to potentially affect people like ships rising all boats, but you're not going to eliminate the individual differences. In fact, you may accentuate them in some ways, because the people who hate structure, like myself, will start getting out of the system when they say, today we're going to do conflict resolution training, and I'm going to go, no, I'm going to do conflict instead. And you run out. So I think our potential for being effective in that space is pretty low. I'd also say that like something like McKinsey or the groups that you see in the substance use domain are people that know they've got an impulse control disorder, right? They know they have troubles keeping their life together, and they want anything to help. For those people who actually want to change their personality, I don't see any ethical way we could say no, right? I have the tools to help you. And again, I think I mentioned this in passing to somebody, when it comes to what we want in education, back to human capital, right? You don't want ephemeral human capital, do you? You assume that if people go to educational settings, learn skills, that they carry them with them into the future. It's their choice about whether to use them or how to use them. I don't see any reason why personality isn't the same thing. You can choose, if you know how to give a good speech in a leadership context, or if you know how to negotiate better in conflict, you can choose to do that, or you can choose to do something else, right? And it is the case that as educators and as people invested in human capital, when we train people, we don't want to do it for naught. We train people in educational settings under the assumption that they're going to go forward with that knowledge and use it. I don't understand why social skills are different in that respect. And I think that's where if you change the marketing a little bit and you choose to focus on the skill side of it, I'm going to teach you how to do negotiation, right? Which I would have died and gone to heaven if I was taught how to do proper negotiation as an 18-year-old, because I failed miserably for the next 20 years until my wife taught me, because she was teaching negotiation. And it's like, oh, that's how you lead out with a bid, right? That's how you work with somebody to be able to get what you want. I had no idea. Why not train 18-year-olds to do that? Might make all of us, ineffective equally, but at least we practice like some decorum, right? So I think there are a couple of things that mitigate the idea that we're doing 1984 if we're going to do this type of training. I don't think we're that danger zone yet.
But then you would need to at least change the definition that you gave at the beginning, that
Right.
it's automatic, right?
Right. Well, no, I mean, in some respects, if it's a skill, then you could train to automaticity, right?
But then it's no longer a choice.
Well, if you can reflect on it. If it's a habit, right? My habit to exercise is a bad thing, right? Because it's automatic. My habit not to eat dessert is a bad thing, So it depends obviously on the content of that habit. But I think if you think about the development of the characteristics that we use, we do have the capacity as humans to metacognate and to contemplate. If somebody comes along, it used to be the fact that you could not eat high-fat diets, right? And you got in the habit of eating certain things because the nutritionists in your country said, do this. And then they changed it all. And we all changed. And then you get in the habit of eating a different way. So I think it's okay. And we're capable of having at least enough free will to choose, even if it becomes the habit. No more questions? Great. Thank you very much.